A longship emerges from the morning mist, its dragon-headed prow cutting through the grey waters. Bearded warriors with horned helmets raise their axes, preparing to descend upon an unsuspecting monastery. Blood will soon stain the sacred stones as the pagans pillage, gold and slaughter monks in a frenzy of violence. This is the Viking of popular imagination, a one-dimensional barbarian bent on destruction. But how much of this familiar image reflects historical reality? The answer might surprise you. The horned helmets. Pure invention, created for a 19th century production of Wagner's Ring Cycle. No authentic Viking helmet has ever been found with horns. The berserker rage? Exaggerated, mindless violence. A simplification that obscures a complex culture of traders, craftspeople, farmers, poets and explorers who operated within sophisticated social and legal frameworks. The real Viking Age was a time of remarkable achievement and transformation. Between the late 8th and mid-11th centuries, Scandinavian sailors, merchants and warriors ventured across vast distances, from North America to the Middle East, from the Arctic Circle to North Africa. They established trade networks spanning continents, founded cities, influenced languages, transformed political structures, and connected isolated regions into an intercontinental web of exchange. Archaeological discoveries in recent decades have dramatically reshaped our understanding of the Norse world. Excavations at urban centres like Birka in Sweden and Hedeby in Denmark reveal sophisticated trading hubs where merchants from across Europe, the Middle East and Asia exchange goods and ideas. Analyses of Viking burials show evidence of cultural exchange, religious complexity, and social stratification far beyond the simple raider stereotype. Genetic studies trace the movement and mixing of populations, revealing nuanced patterns of migration, settlement, and integration. The Vikings were not a unified people with a single identity. They came from what are now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, distinct kingdoms with different cultures, dialects, and patterns of expansion. They were not even called Vikings in their own time. The term Vikingar in Old Norse referred specifically to those who went on expeditions, usually for raiding. Many Scandinavians of the era never raided at all, remaining farmers, craftspeople, or local traders. Who were these people who burst onto the European stage with such dramatic impact? What drove them to leave their northern homelands and risk perilous journeys across open seas? How did they navigate thousands of miles without compasses or charts? What beliefs guided their worldview before Christianity? How did relatively small groups manage to exert such disproportionate influence across multiple continents? As we journey through the Viking Age, we'll explore not just what happened, but why, examining the environmental, technological, political, and cultural factors that converge to create this remarkable chapter in human history. We'll separate myth from reality, propaganda from evidence, and modern projection from historical truth. In doing so, we'll discover a society far more nuanced, sophisticated, and influential than the caricature that has dominated popular culture for centuries. Long before the first recorded Viking raid, Scandinavia was undergoing profound changes. The migration period, 400 to 550 CE, had reshaped Europe as Germanic peoples moved across the continent, fleeing the advancing Huns or seeking new lands. While much of Europe experienced this tumult directly, Scandinavia remained somewhat insulated, developing distinctive cultural patterns that would later fuel its explosive outward expansion. Archaeological evidence from pre-Viking Scandinavia reveals a society already organising into hierarchical structures. At Upokra in southern Sweden, excavations have uncovered a settlement continuously occupied for over a millennium before the Viking Age. This proto-urban centre featured a ceremonial building rebuilt in the same location for generations, suggesting established religious practices and political continuity. Similar sites at Gudme in Denmark and Helgö in Sweden show concentrations of wealth and specialised craft production centuries before the first Viking raids. These early centres weren't yet true towns, but served as seasonal gathering places where regional elites could display their status, conduct trade, settle disputes, and perform religious ceremonies. Magnificent gold bracteates, medallions, and finely crafted jewellery from these sites demonstrate sophisticated metalworking traditions that would later be applied to the distinctive Viking art styles. Could these pre-Viking settlements, with their evidence of social stratification and craft specialisation, have been incubating the complex society that would later expand across continents? Recent archaeological finds suggest exactly that. The Viking phenomenon didn't emerge from nowhere, but evolved from increasingly sophisticated Scandinavian cultures of the 6th and 7th centuries. The social structure of pre-Viking Scandinavia centred around the institution of chieftaincy. Society was divided into 3 broad classes: jarls, aristocrats; carls, free farmers; and thralls, slaves. Chieftains derived their power from a combination of inherited status, wealth, and most importantly, their ability to attract and maintain followers through generosity and success in war. The hall was the centre of social and political life, a place where chieftains displayed their wealth through feasting and gift-giving. These wooden structures, like the one excavated at Borg in northern Norway, measuring over 80 metres long, served as stages for the complex reciprocal relationships that bound leaders to followers. A successful chieftain needed to be both a warrior and a provider of wealth to his retinue, creating pressure to acquire resources that could be redistributed. This gift economy, where status came from giving rather than accumulating wealth, would later fuel Viking raiding and trading. When chieftains needed more silver, gold, and luxury goods to maintain their position, they looked beyond their borders. Even before the Viking Age proper, Scandinavians were not isolated from European developments. Archaeological evidence shows extensive trade connections with the continent and British Isles. Roman coins, glass vessels, and other luxury items have been found throughout Scandinavia, demonstrating long-distance exchange networks. The magnificent ship burial at Sutton Hoo in England, likely of an East Anglian king with Swedish connections, shows the complex interrelationships between Scandinavia and Britain in the 7th century. By the 8th century, trading centres were developing along the Baltic and North Sea coasts. Ribe in Denmark, founded around 700 CE, shows evidence of craft specialisation, long-distance trade, and permanent settlement. Decades before the first recorded Viking raids, these emerging market towns created networks of exchange and knowledge that would later facilitate Viking expansion. Perhaps the most crucial pre-Viking development was in shipbuilding technology. The transition from rowing vessels to sailing ships represented a technological revolution that made the Viking Age possible. The earliest evidence for Scandinavian sailing vessels dates to around 700 CE, just before the first raids. The Kvalsund ship, found in Norway and dating to around 700 CE, shows intermediate features between rowing vessels and true Viking ships. What made Viking ships exceptional was their unique combination of features: clinker-built hulls with overlapping planks for flexibility in rough seas, shallow drafts allowing navigation in rivers and beach landings, symmetrical designs permitting forward or backward movement without turning, and a keel-to-length ratio that provided both stability and speed. These vessels were lightweight enough to be portaged between waterways, yet strong enough to withstand ocean voyages. This maritime technology didn't appear overnight. It evolved through centuries of refinement, as Scandinavians adapted to their environment of fjords, islands, and inland waterways. By the late 8th century, these ships had developed into the most advanced naval technology in Europe, a crucial advantage that would allow Vikings to strike quickly, navigate rivers deep into continental interiors, and establish trade routes spanning thousands of miles. As the 8th century progressed, population pressure, climate fluctuations, and political consolidation created conditions ripe for expansion. When opportunity presented itself in the form of wealthy, poorly defended religious centres abroad, Scandinavians had both the means and motivation to strike. The storm was gathering. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. So wrote the Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin in 793 CE, reacting to the shocking news that had reached the court of Charlemagne. The holy island of Lindisfarne, off England's northeastern coast, had been attacked by seaborne raiders from the north. The date, June 8th, 793, would later be marked as the conventional beginning of the Viking Age. Lindisfarne was no ordinary target. Founded by the Irish monk Aidan in 635 CE, it had become one of the most sacred sites in the Christian Anglo-Saxon world, famous for its illuminated manuscripts and as the cult centre of St. Cuthbert. The psychological impact of this attack was profound. If God would not protect even his most devoted servants, what hope did ordinary communities have? The raid itself was brutally efficient. Arriving in their swift longships, the Scandinavian warriors struck without warning on a summer morning. The monastery's wealth, accumulated over generations in the form of gold and silver religious objects, manuscripts with jewelled covers, and stored food supplies, was defenceless. The monks committed to non-violence could offer little resistance as the raiders killed some, took others as slaves, and stripped the sanctuary of its treasures. What made the Lindisfarne raid particularly shocking was not just its target, but its execution. Unlike land-based armies that could be tracked and intercepted, these seaborne raiders appeared seemingly from nowhere, struck quickly, and vanished back to sea before local forces could respond. This tactical advantage would define Viking raiding for generations. Contrary to popular belief, Lindisfarne wasn't actually the first Viking raid on Britain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in 789 CE, 3 ships of Northmen landed at Portland in Dorset, where they killed a royal official who mistook them for merchants. Archaeological evidence suggests even earlier, unrecorded raids. What made Lindisfarne different was its symbolic significance and the written records it generated. Following Lindisfarne, the pattern of Viking raiding quickly established itself. In 794, the monastery at Jarrow was attacked. In 795, the sacred islands of Iona, Skye, and Rathlin off Scotland and Ireland were raided. By 800, Viking ships were appearing regularly along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and Francia. These early raids followed a consistent pattern: quick strikes against wealthy, poorly defended targets, primarily churches and monasteries, followed by immediate withdrawal to the sea. The raiders operated in small groups with just a few ships, suggesting independent operators rather than royal fleets. They focused on portable wealth, gold, silver, and captives for the slave trade, rather than land acquisition. European responses to these early raids were disorganised and ineffective. Political fragmentation meant there was no coordinated defence strategy. Local forces were rarely able to mobilise quickly enough to intercept the raiders. Coastal warning systems and fortifications were minimal or non-existent. The psychological shock of these attacks, especially against sacred sites, created an atmosphere of terror disproportionate to the actual military threat. Contemporary Christian writers interpreted the Viking raids as divine punishment for sins. Alcuin explicitly connected the Lindisfarne attack to moral failings. Consider carefully, brothers, and examine diligently, lest perchance this unaccustomed and unheard of evil was merited by some unheard of evil practice. This theological interpretation shaped how the raids were recorded, emphasising their brutality and portraying the Vikings as instruments of God's wrath. But what drove these Scandinavians to suddenly strike outward in the late 8th century? The question continues to generate debate among historians, but several interconnected factors likely contributed to this dramatic expansion. Climate change may have played a significant role. The Viking Age coincided with the medieval warm period, which made farming more productive in Scandinavia, potentially supporting population growth that created pressure for expansion. However, climate fluctuations also brought periods of hardship, possibly pushing some to seek wealth abroad when local resources became strained. Population pressure in parts of Scandinavia, particularly western Norway, with its limited arable land, created incentives for young men to seek fortunes elsewhere. Inheritance customs that favoured eldest sons left many younger men without land, forming a pool of potential raiders and settlers. Political consolidation was beginning in Scandinavia as ambitious chieftains worked to expand their power. This competition created both push factors, defeated rivals seeking new territories, and pull factors, successful leaders needing wealth to reward followers. Perhaps most significantly, opportunity aligned with capability. Scandinavian shipbuilding technology had reached a point where long-distance raiding became feasible, just as Western European wealth was increasingly concentrated in vulnerable ecclesiastical centres. The fragmentation of Charlemagne's empire after his death in 814 created additional political instability that Vikings would exploit. Knowledge of wealthy, poorly defended targets spread quickly through Scandinavian networks. The success of early raiders inspired imitators, creating a snowball effect as more chieftains organised expeditions. What began as small-scale raiding would soon evolve into something far more ambitious. While raiders were making their first tentative strikes abroad, the vast majority of Scandinavians remained at home, continuing lives centred around farming, fishing, and local trade. To understand the Viking phenomenon fully, we must look beyond the dramatic raids to examine the society that produced these explorers, traders, and warriors. The typical Scandinavian landscape was one of scattered farmsteads rather than villages. Archaeological excavations at sites like Borg in Norway, Vorbass in Denmark, and Gien in Sweden reveal farmhouses that combined living quarters for the family with space for livestock under a single roof, a practical arrangement for the long northern winters. These longhouses, constructed of timber with thatched roofs, typically ranged from 15 to 30 metres in length, with the largest reaching over 80 metres at chieftain estates. Inside these dwellings, life centred around the central hearth, which provided both warmth and light during the long winter nights. Sleeping platforms lined the walls, often covered with furs. Loom weights found in many excavations indicate that textile production was an ongoing household activity. Cooking was done in iron cauldrons suspended over the fire or in clay pots. Meals typically consisted of porridge, bread, dairy products, preserved meat and fish, supplemented with seasonal vegetables, fruits and nuts. What might surprise modern observers is the relative cleanliness of Viking dwellings compared to later medieval standards. Combs, tweezers, ear spoons, and other grooming implements are common archaeological finds suggesting attention to personal hygiene. The Norse even had a dedicated bathing day, Saturday, or Laugardaga, washing day, which survives in modern Scandinavian words for Saturday. The archaeological record reveals a society with clear gender roles, yet one that afforded women significant rights and responsibilities compared to much of contemporary Europe. This paradox of Viking gender relations continues to fascinate historians. How could a warrior society also grant women legal powers that wouldn't become common elsewhere in Europe until centuries later? Women managed the household economy, which encompassed not just cooking and childcare, but also dairy production, textile manufacturing, food preservation, and often brewing, all critical economic activities. The keys hanging at a woman's belt symbolised her authority over household resources. In wealthy households, women directed the work of servants and slaves. Legally, Norse women could own property, inherit, initiate divorce under certain conditions, and reclaim their dowries if marriage is ended. They could conduct business and represent themselves in legal proceedings. The Icelandic sagas, though recorded later, depict women exercising considerable influence, sometimes goading male relatives to action to uphold family honour. While men dominated public and political spheres, women's domestic authority was substantial and recognised. This division reflected practical realities in a society where men were frequently absent on trading, raiding, or fishing expeditions. women needed legal and economic autonomy to manage affairs in their absence. Evidence for female warriors, a topic of intense debate, remains limited but intriguing. The controversial Birka warrior grave in Sweden, containing a body biologically female but buried with full warrior equipment, suggests that at least occasionally women might have taken on martial roles. However, such cases appear exceptional rather than normative. Family structure in Viking Age Scandinavia was based on the extended household rather than the nuclear family. Multiple generations lived together, often along with non-related workers and slaves. Kinship was paramount, with family connections determining one's place in society, legal protections, and obligations. Children entered adult roles early by modern standards. Girls learned household management and crafts from their mothers and other female relatives. Boys began training in weapons from young ages, while also learning farming, fishing, or craft skills. By their early teens, many young men would join trading or raiding expeditions as part of their transition to adulthood. The Scandinavian economy combined agriculture, animal husbandry, hunting, fishing, and specialised crafts. In coastal regions, fishing provided crucial protein sources, while inland areas relied more heavily on livestock. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses were the primary domestic animals, valued for meat, milk, wool, transportation, and as status symbols. Farming techniques remained relatively simple, using wooden yards, primitive ploughs, rather than heavy ploughs, limiting agricultural productivity. The short growing season in northern regions created vulnerability to crop failures, which might have contributed to raiding as a supplementary economic activity. Craft specialisation had advanced significantly by the Viking Age. Archaeological evidence shows sophisticated metalworking, wood carving, jewellery making, shipbuilding, and textile production. Many crafts had spiritual or magical associations. Smiths, for instance, were often regarded with a mixture of respect and suspicion due to their transformative skills. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Norse society was its approach to law and governance. Unlike much of contemporary Europe, Scandinavia had no central authority imposing law from above. Instead, law was conceived as something discovered rather than created, an existing reality to be found through consensus and tradition. The primary institution for legal and political matters was the thing, an assembly of freemen who gathered periodically to resolve disputes, make communal decisions, and occasionally select kings. The thing met at established outdoor locations, often marked by standing stones or distinctive natural features. Major assemblies like the Althing in Iceland could draw participants from hundreds of miles around. At these assemblies, legal specialists called law speakers would recite the law from memory. As Norse society was primarily oral before the adoption of Christianity brought wider literacy. Disputes were resolved through a combination of witness testimony, oath-taking, and sometimes ordeal by fire or water. The emphasis was on compensation rather than punishment. Even killings were typically settled through carefully calculated payments to the victim's family rather than execution of the perpetrator. This system created a society that, while violent by modern standards, operated within sophisticated legal frameworks that prevented blood feuds from escalating indefinitely. Honour was paramount, but so was the pragmatic need to maintain social cohesion in small communities where everyone depended on mutual cooperation for survival. The thing system also limited the power of early Scandinavian kings, who were more first among equals than absolute rulers. Royal authority depended on personal charisma, military success, and the ability to dispense wealth to followers. Kings needed regular approval from thing assemblies, creating a check on power that would gradually erode as the Viking Age progressed and monarchies consolidated their authority. This legal tradition would have profound influence wherever Vikings settled, contributing elements to English common law and establishing one of the world's oldest parliamentary traditions in Iceland. The balance between individual rights and communal obligations, the emphasis on public proceedings, and the concept of law as discovered rather than imposed would shape legal development across northern Europe. If one innovation defined the Viking Age, it was the longship, a vessel so perfectly adapted to its purposes that it transformed Scandinavian raiders from coastal nuisances into a hemispheric force. What made these ships revolutionary wasn't any single feature, but their unique combination of characteristics, creating the most versatile seafaring technology of the early medieval world. The construction of a Viking ship began with the selection of oak trees, ideally those naturally curved to form the stems and ribs. Using axes, adzes and augers, shipwrights split planks radially from logs, following the grain to create stronger boards than would be possible with sawn timber. These planks were then overlapped in clinker, or lapstrake construction, with each plank fastened to the next by iron rivets, creating a flexible hull that could twist slightly in heavy seas without breaking. The keel, a massive timber running the length of the vessel, provided longitudinal strength, while still allowing the shallow draft necessary for beach landings and river navigation. Crossbeams tied the sides together and supported decking, while an ingenious system of wooden pegs rather than rigid nails connected the ribs to the hull planking, allowing the ship to flex as a unified structure in rough waters. This flexibility proved crucial for vessels operating in the notoriously harsh North Atlantic. Unlike the rigid hulls of Mediterranean ships designed for calmer waters, the longship could ride over waves rather than fighting against them, absorbing the impact through its entire structure. Survivors of modern replica voyages often describe the sensation as being part of the sea rather than fighting it. The iconic dragon or serpent heads adorning the prows weren't merely decorative. These removable carvings served multiple purposes: intimidation of enemies, protection against sea spirits, and practical identification of vessels from a distance. They were typically removed when approaching friendly territory to signal peaceful intentions. Propulsion came from both oars and a single square sail made of woven wool, providing operational flexibility impossible for purely sailing or rowing vessels. When winds were favourable, the sail dramatically extended range and conserved energy. When winds failed or precise manoeuvring was needed, oars provided reliable power. This dual capability allowed Vikings to strike predictably, regardless of wind conditions, a military advantage that their victims, accustomed to the limitations of contemporary shipping, initially failed to appreciate. The archaeological record has preserved several Viking vessels that illuminate their evolution. The Oseberg ship, built around 820 CE and discovered in a burial mound in Norway, represents the aristocratic end of the spectrum, a beautifully decorated vessel, likely used for coastal journeys rather than ocean voyages. The Gokstad ship from around 890 CE shows a more seaworthy design, while the Skuldelev ships, 5 vessels deliberately sunk to block a Danish fjord, around 1070, demonstrate the diversity of specialised craft that had developed by the late Viking Age. How did these mariners navigate the open ocean without compasses, sextants or charts? This question has puzzled historians for centuries, with the Norse sagas offering only tantalisingly vague descriptions. Recent experimental archaeology has suggested a combination of techniques including solar positioning, star observations, awareness of prevailing winds and currents, monitoring of wildlife and cloud formations, and possibly the use of primitive sunstones, crystals that can determine the sun's position even in overcast conditions. The Vikings' practical knowledge of their environment was extensive. They understood that certain birds would fly toward land in the evening, that specific cloud formations gathered over islands, and that ocean swells changed character near coasts. They navigated by sailing along latitude lines, maintaining a consistent solar elevation that would lead them to known land masses. Most importantly, they accepted risk as inevitable, understanding that discovery required venturing into the unknown with imperfect information. Their sailing season typically ran from spring to early autumn, avoiding the worst winter storms. Even within this window, voyages were planned around weather patterns and seasonal winds. The journey from Norway to Iceland, for instance, was best undertaken in spring, when prevailing easterlies could carry ships westward. Return voyages waited for autumn winds from the west. This awareness of seasonal patterns allowed for surprisingly reliable long-distance travel despite technological limitations. The effectiveness of these navigation methods is demonstrated by the Norse discovery and settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and ultimately North America, achievements that would not be replicated by other Europeans for centuries. Their ability to return repeatedly to distant locations, establishing stable trade routes across open ocean, represents one of history's most impressive feats of pre-instrumental navigation. If ships enabled Viking mobility, their weapons and tactics determined their effectiveness once they arrived. The archetypal Viking warrior carried a combination of weapons suited to different combat situations. The spear served as the primary weapon for most, economical to produce, effective in formation fighting, and versatile for both thrusting and throwing. Swords, more expensive and status-laden, were typically carried only by wealthier warriors. The battle axe, perhaps the weapon most associated with Vikings in popular culture, provided devastating cutting power, capable of defeating shields and armour. Archaeological finds reveal sophisticated weapon-making technology. The best Viking swords featured pattern-welded blades, a technique where iron strips of varying carbon content were twisted and hammered together, creating both strength and flexibility. Some incorporated steel edges around softer iron cores, optimizing both sharpness and resistance to breaking. Certain blades bore maker's marks or inscriptions, suggesting specialized workshops and early brand recognition. Defensive equipment typically included a round wooden shield rimmed with iron, sometimes covered with leather. Helmets, contrary to popular depictions with horns, were simple conical or segmented designs with nose guards. Mail shirts, byrnies, provided excellent protection, but were expensive and relatively rare, with most warriors relying primarily on shields for defence. Viking battle tactics evolved over the period. Early raids relied on surprise and mobility rather than pitched battles. Ships would approach quietly, warriors would land at unexpected locations, strike quickly, and retreat before local forces could organise effective resistance. As their ambitions grew from raiding to conquest, Vikings adapted to more conventional warfare, including siege techniques and formation fighting. The most famous Viking battle formation was the shield wall, Skjaldborg, a tight line of overlapping shields that created a nearly impenetrable barrier when properly maintained. Breaking an enemy's shield wall became the primary objective in pitched battles, often achieved through concentrated pressure at weak points or by creating gaps with missile weapons. Much has been written about berserkers, warriors supposedly fighting in a trance-like fury without armour. While contemporary accounts mention such fighters, the reality was likely less mystical than later depictions suggest. Some warriors may have used mind-altering substances or psychological techniques to overcome fear, but the image of uncontrollable, frenzied fighters contradicts the disciplined tactics evident in Viking military successes. Viking warfare was neither mindlessly brutal nor particularly chivalrous by the standards of the time. It was pragmatic, adaptable, and focused on achieving objectives with minimal losses. When raiding, Vikings preferred to avoid pitched battles entirely. When conquest became the goal, they showed remarkable ability to adapt to local conditions, learning siege warfare, horseback fighting, and other techniques as needed. This pragmatism extended to their treatment of opponents. Contrary to their portrayal in Christian sources as uniquely savage, Vikings operated according to the harsh standards of early medieval warfare. They could be merciful when ransom was profitable, and ruthless when resistance threatened their objectives. Their reputation for extreme brutality stems largely from their targeting of religious sites. Attacks seen as sacrilegious by Christian chroniclers, but viewed by the Vikings themselves as simply striking the wealthiest, least defended targets. The combination of superior naval mobility, effective weapons, and adaptive tactics gave Vikings a military advantage disproportionate to their numbers. A force of a few hundred warriors could threaten regions with much larger populations by striking unpredictably, exploiting political divisions, and withdrawing before effective resistance could be organised. This mobility-based advantage would remain central to Viking operations throughout the age of expansion. Before Christianity gradually transformed Scandinavia, the Norse inhabited a mental landscape populated by gods, giants, elves, dwarves, and other supernatural beings. Their cosmology, preserved primarily through later Icelandic texts, presented a universe both complex and precarious, where even the gods faced ultimate defeat in the prophesied battle of Ragnarok. At the centre of this cosmos stood Yggdrasil, the World Tree, an immense ash connecting 9 realms spread across 3 levels. At the top level sat Asgard, home of the Aesir gods, Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods, and Alfheim, realm of the Light Elves. The middle level contained Midgard, the human world, Jotunheim, land of giants, Nidavellir, dwarf realm, and Svartalfheim, dark elf world. The lowest level held Helheim, realm of the dead, and Niflheim, world of ice and mist. This cosmic geography wasn't merely mythological, but shaped how the Norse understood their place in the universe. Humans occupying a middle position between higher and lower powers. The tree itself suffered constant damage. A dragon gnawed at its roots, 4 deer consumed its foliage, and decay threatened its trunk. This imagery of cosmic vulnerability reflected the Norse view of existence as inherently unstable, requiring constant maintenance through proper ritual and action. Unlike the omnipotent deity of Christianity, Norse gods were powerful but limited beings with distinct personalities and flaws. They fell broadly into 2 groups: the Aesir, associated with war and governance, and the Vanir, linked to fertility and prosperity. According to myth, these 2 divine families had once fought before reaching an accommodation, perhaps reflecting historical tensions between different religious practices in early Scandinavia. Odin the All-Father ruled as chief of the Aesir, a complex deity associated with wisdom, poetry, death and magic. He sacrificed an eye for knowledge and hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days to gain understanding of the runes. Depicted as one-eyed, often accompanied by ravens and wolves, Odin represented the pursuit of wisdom through sacrifice. His hall, Valhalla, received half of those slain in battle, collected by his female warrior emissaries, the Valkyries. Thor, son of Odin, embodied physical strength and protection. Armed with his hammer Mjolnir, Thor defended both gods and humans against the chaotic forces of the giants. Archaeological evidence suggests Thor was particularly popular among common people, with hammer amulets being the most frequently found religious symbols from the Viking Age. As a guardian against chaos and a god associated with weather and crops, Thor represented the necessary force that maintained cosmic and social order. Freyr and Freya, twin deities of the Vanir, governed fertility, sexuality, and prosperity. Freya, who received the other half of battle-slain warriors, in her hall Folkvanga, was associated with love, beauty, and Sedr, a form of magic particularly connected with women. Freya governed male fertility, sunshine, and rain. Their father Njörður ruled the sea and maritime prosperity, vital concerns for a seafaring culture. Loki, a figure of ambiguous status, represented both creativity and destructive chaos. Neither fully god nor giant, Loki alternately helped and hindered the gods, eventually bringing about their downfall by orchestrating the death of Baldur, god of light and purity. His complex character embodied the Norse recognition that creation and destruction were inseparable forces. Lesser deities governed specific domains. Tyr oversaw law and justice. Heimdall guarded the rainbow bridge Bifrost connecting the realms. Frigg, Odin's wife, protected marriage and motherhood. Hel ruled the underworld realm named after her. Beyond the gods, supernatural beings included elves, associated with fertility, dwarves, master craftsmen, giants, primordial forces of chaos, and various spirits inhabiting the natural world. What makes Norse religion particularly distinctive is its fatalistic outlook. Unlike many belief systems where good ultimately triumphs, Norse mythology culminates in Ragnarök, the fate of the gods, where cosmic order would collapse, most deities would perish in battle against chaotic forces, and the world would be destroyed before a new cycle began. This acceptance of inevitable doom, coupled with the ideal of facing it with courage, profoundly shaped Norse ethics and worldview. How did these beliefs manifest in actual religious practice? Archaeological evidence, combined with later textual sources, suggests a combination of public ceremonies and private household worship. Large temples existed, though they were likely simpler structures than contemporary Christian churches. The most famous, the temple at Uppsala described by Adam of Bremen around 1075 CE, featured statues of Thor, Odin, and Freyr, with sacrifices performed on a 9-year cycle. More common were smaller shrines and sacred groves where local communities gathered for seasonal celebrations. The archaeological record shows ritual deposits in bogs, lakes and wells, offerings to supernatural powers that included weapons, jewellery, food, and occasionally animals or humans. Excavations at Apokra in Sweden revealed a ceremonial building, repeatedly reconstructed in the same location over centuries, suggesting continuity in sacred space. The religious calendar centred around seasonal transitions. While details varied regionally, common celebrations included midwinter festivities, later incorporated into Christmas, spring equinox rituals for fertility, midsummer celebrations and harvest festivals. These observances combined religious ceremony with community gathering, feast and entertainment, reinforcing social bonds while honouring the gods. Ritual sacrifices, blót, formed the core of public worship. These ranged from offerings of food and drink to animal sacrifices and, in extreme circumstances, human sacrifice. The latter, while sensationalised in some accounts, appears to have been exceptional rather than routine. Archaeological evidence confirms some instances, such as the bodies found at Trelleborg in Denmark and the description of sacrifices at Uppsala. But these represent extraordinary circumstances rather than regular practice. More typical was the ceremonial slaughter of livestock, particularly in autumn when herds needed thinning before winter. The meat would be consumed in communal feasts after a portion was dedicated to the gods, combining practical necessity with religious observance. Ritual drinking played a central role, with toasts to gods and ancestors forming a structured part of ceremonies. Private worship centred around the household. Each family maintained its own relationship with gods, ancestors, and local spirits. Small figurines of deities found in domestic contexts suggest household shrines. The concept of luck, hamingja, was particularly important, a kind of inheritable spiritual force that could be strengthened or weakened by proper or improper action. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of Norse religious practice was its pragmatism. The relationship between humans and gods resembled a transaction more than unconditional devotion. Worshippers made offerings with the expectation of specific benefits, good harvests, victory in battle, safe voyages, rather than for abstract spiritual salvation. If a deity failed to deliver the expected results, worshippers might redirect their attention to more responsive gods. This transactional approach helps explain the relatively peaceful transition to Christianity in many areas. When Norse rulers converted, often for political advantages, many subjects pragmatically accepted the new god who seemed to be delivering success to their leaders. The old beliefs didn't disappear overnight, but gradually blended with Christian practices in a syncretic process that would continue for centuries. Norse concepts of death and afterlife were more complex than the popular image of Valhalla suggests. While warriors might hope to join Odin's chosen Einherjar to feast and fight until Ragnarök, this was just one possible posthumous destination. Some might join Freyr in Folkvanga, others descend to Hell's realm, not initially a place of punishment, but simply the dwelling of most dead. while still others might remain near their burial mounds as Draugr corporeal undead, or join the ancestors guarding the family. Burial practices reflected these varied beliefs. Archaeological evidence shows considerable diversity. Cremations and inhumations, simple graves and elaborate ship burials, bodies accompanied by rich goods or interred with minimal offerings. Status, cause of death, personal beliefs, and regional traditions all influenced funerary customs. The most spectacular Viking burials involved ships, like those found at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway. These elaborate interments included not just vessels, but extensive grave goods, weapons, tools, food, clothing, furniture, slaughtered animals, and occasionally sacrificed servants or slaves. Such burials represented enormous economic investment, reserved for the highest elites. More common were cremations on pyres, with the ashes placed in urns or pits, sometimes under mounds. Grave goods typically included personal items and tools appropriate to the deceased's gender and status, weapons and tools for men, jewellery, textile implements, and household items for women. These provisions suggest belief in a material afterlife requiring physical objects. The religious world of the Vikings was not static, but evolved throughout the period. Early Viking Age religion appears more focused on Thor and fertility deities, while Odin gained prominence later, particularly among warrior elites. As Scandinavians encountered Christians abroad, religious ideas cross-fertilised, with concepts from both traditions influencing each other during the long conversion process. This spiritual framework, with its emphasis on fate, courage in the face of inevitable defeat, and maintaining cosmic order against chaos, provided psychological underpinning for the Viking phenomenon. It shaped a worldview where daring exploration, raiding, and even death in distant lands could be meaningful within a cosmic narrative of predetermined destiny faced with unflinching courage. After the initial shock of raids on coastal monasteries, Viking activity in the British Isles intensified dramatically in the mid-9th century. What began as seasonal raiding evolved into something far more ambitious, conquest and settlement that would permanently alter the political and cultural landscape of Britain and Ireland. The transformation began in 865 CE with the arrival of what Anglo-Saxon chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army, a force larger and more organised than previous raiding parties. Led by the sons of the semi-legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, including Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. This army didn't follow the established pattern of raiding and retreating. Instead, they established winter camps, brought horses for mobility, and systematically targeted Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, one by one. Their first major victory came against the Kingdom of Northumbria. Exploiting a civil war between rival claimants to the Northumbrian throne, the Vikings captured York, which they called Jorvik, in 866. This strategically located Roman city became their power base in northern England. Archaeological excavations at Coppergate in York have revealed a thriving Viking Age urban centre with evidence of craft specialisation, international trade and cultural blending. From this secure foothold, the Great Army turned south, defeating the Kingdom of East Anglia in 869. A campaign marked by the execution of King Edmund, later venerated as a saint. Mercia fell next, with its king driven into exile in 873. By 874, only the Kingdom of Wessex under Alfred the Great remained to oppose Viking dominance in England. Alfred's ultimate success in halting the Viking advance, beginning with his victory at the Battle of Edington in 878, prevented complete Scandinavian conquest of England. The resulting treaty established Danelaw, a region of northern and eastern England where Danish law and customs would prevail. This agreement transformed what had been a military occupation into a framework for settlement and governance. The archaeological footprint of this settlement is evident in place names, burial patterns, and material culture. Across the Danelaw, hundreds of place names ending in dash by dash, meaning farm or village, dash, thorp, dash, secondary settlement, dash and dash, toft, dash, homestead mark areas of Scandinavian influence. Lincoln, Derby, Whitby, and scores of other modern towns bear these linguistic markers of Viking settlement. DNA studies of modern British populations confirm substantial Scandinavian genetic contribution in these regions. Recent research suggests that between 2% and 4% of modern British DNA derives from Norwegian and Danish settlers of this period, a proportion that rises to 10 to 15% in some parts of northern and eastern England. The nature of this settlement remains debated. Was it primarily military colonisation by male warriors, or did it involve significant numbers of women and families? Archaeological evidence increasingly supports substantial female migration, with distinctively Scandinavian female grave goods and jewellery found throughout Danelaw. This suggests family migration, rather than simply male warriors taking local wives. In Danelaw, a distinctive Anglo-Scandinavian culture emerged, blending elements from both traditions. Architectural styles, artistic motifs, legal concepts and vocabulary merged to create something neither purely Norse nor Anglo-Saxon. The English language itself was profoundly influenced, incorporating everyday Norse words like sky, egg, law, husband, window, and hundreds more, evidence of intimate daily interaction rather than mere political overlay. Viking influence extended beyond the Danelaw through continued raiding and political manoeuvring. A second wave of Norse activity began in the early 10th century, with new armies arriving from Denmark. By the early 11th century, England would briefly become part of a North Sea empire under the Danish king Cnut, a development we'll explore in a later section. While England experienced a pattern of conquest and settlement, Ireland faced a different Viking impact. Beginning with coastal raids in the 790s, Viking activity in Ireland initially followed familiar patterns of targeting monasteries and their wealth. By the 840s, however, Vikings began establishing permanent coastal bases that would evolve into Ireland's first true urban centres. Dublin, from the Norse Dyflin, derived from the Irish Dublin, was founded as a long fort, a ship base and trading centre, around 841. Archaeological excavations have revealed a bustling settlement with evidence of shipbuilding, metalworking, trade in amber, walrus ivory, and slaves, and connections spanning from the North Atlantic to the Middle East. Similar Norse settlements were established at Wexford, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick, names still borne by major Irish cities. Unlike in England, Vikings never controlled large territorial expanses in Ireland. Their power remained concentrated in coastal enclaves, from which they engaged in both trade and raiding. These settlements maintained connections with the Isle of Man, Hebrides, and Norway, creating a maritime network across the Irish Sea region. The relationship between Norse settlers and native Irish was complex and fluid. Periods of conflict alternated with alliances, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. By the mid-10th century, many Norse settlers in Ireland had adopted elements of Irish culture and Christianity, while maintaining distinctive identities and overseas connections. The term Hiberno-Norse describes this syncretic culture that was neither purely Scandinavian nor Irish. Ireland's political fragmentation, with numerous small kingdoms rather than larger states, created both opportunities and limitations for Viking ambitions. While preventing unified resistance, it also meant Vikings could never establish dominance comparable to the Danelaw. Instead, Norse leaders became one more factor in the complex power dynamics of Irish politics, sometimes achieving significant influence through alliances with Irish kings. The Scottish Isles experienced perhaps the most thorough Scandinavian colonisation in the British Isles. The Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland, Hebrides, and Isle of Man came under direct Norse control, with substantial settlement evidenced by place names, archaeological remains, and genetic studies. In Orkney and Shetland, Norse language, Norn, continued to be spoken until the 18th century, long after Viking political control had ended. Orkney became a particularly important Norse earldom, controlling sea routes between Scandinavia, Scotland and Ireland. From their base at Kirkwall, the Earls of Orkney maintained significant autonomy. sometimes acknowledging Norwegian overlordship while pursuing independent policies. The Orkney-Inga saga records their history, depicting a society that maintained Norse traditions while developing distinctive local characteristics. The Isle of Man developed a unique Hiberno-Norse culture, evidenced by its remarkable stone crosses combining Celtic artistic traditions with Norse imagery. These monuments, like the Thorwald's Cross, show scenes from both Christian and Norse mythology, visual evidence of cultural and religious blending. This Western expansion represented more than military conquest. It created new hybrid societies and trade networks connecting Scandinavia with the British Isles, continental Europe, and beyond. Dublin became a central hub in a maritime trading system linking Bristol, York, and Norwegian ports. Luxury goods, raw materials, and unfortunately slaves moved through these networks, enriching Norse elites and stimulating urban development. The Vikings' impact on British and Irish societies was transformative but not simply destructive. While their initial raids devastated established centres, particularly monasteries, their subsequent settlement contributed to urbanisation, commercial development, artistic innovation, and political evolution. The threat they posed stimulated state formation, particularly in England, where Alfred and his successors built more centralised governance, partly in response to the Viking challenge. As the 9th century gave way to the 10th, these Western Viking settlements increasingly integrated into local power structures. Many adopted Christianity, formed political alliances with native rulers, and developed distinctive cultural identities that were neither purely Scandinavian nor fully assimilated. Meanwhile, the Scandinavian homelands themselves were undergoing profound transformations, consolidating into kingdoms that would project power in new ways across northern Europe and beyond. As Viking raiders accumulated wealth abroad, profound changes were reshaping their Scandinavian homelands. The 9th and 10th centuries witnessed the emergence of stronger, more centralised kingdoms from what had been a patchwork of chieftaincies and petty realms. This political consolidation would transform not only Scandinavia itself, but also the nature of Viking activity abroad, as ambitious kings sought to harness and direct the energies that had previously fueled independent raiding. In Norway, this process is traditionally associated with Harald Fairhair, Old Norse Harald Harfagri, whose saga depicts him as the first king to unite the country. According to later accounts, particularly Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, Harald's unification campaign began with a dramatic oath, rejected by a princess named Gyda, who declared she would only marry the man who could rule all of Norway. The young Harald vowed neither to cut nor comb his hair until he had conquered the entire country, hence his nickname Fair Hair, or Fine Hair. Whether this romantic motivation is historical or legendary, archaeological and contemporary evidence confirms that a ruler named Harald achieved unprecedented power in western and central Norway during the late 9th century. Through a combination of military victories, strategic marriages, and political alliances, he subdued or expelled rival chieftains and jarls who refused to acknowledge his overlordship. The pivotal moment in Harald's campaign came at the naval battle of Hafrsfjord, fought around 872 CE near modern Stavanger. Here, Harald defeated a coalition of opponents from southwestern Norway, establishing his supremacy over the coastal regions. Stone monuments at Harald's Haugen in Haugesund, traditionally identified as Harald's burial place, commemorate this achievement, though historians debate whether he truly controlled all the territories later attributed to him. Harald's methods of governance set patterns that would influence Scandinavian kingship for generations. Rather than attempting direct rule over his vast territories, he installed loyal jarls, earls, as regional governors, bound to him through oaths of loyalty and family connections. He established a system of royal estates across the country where he could stay while travelling his realm, collected taxes from coastal and agricultural regions, and maintained a formidable military retinue through the wealth these revenues provided. The consequences of Harald's unification extended far beyond Norway's borders. Many chieftains who opposed him chose exile rather than submission, taking their followers to the British Isles, Iceland and other territories. This political exodus contributed significantly to Norse settlement abroad, particularly in previously uninhabited Iceland, which received many of Norway's displaced aristocratic families. The Icelandic sagas preserve their bitter perspective on Harald, portraying him as a tyrant whose overreach forced freedom-loving Norsemen to seek new homes. Despite Harald's achievements, Norwegian unification remained incomplete and contested. His numerous sons fought among themselves after his death, traditionally dated around 930 CE, fragmenting his realm. It would take generations and the efforts of later rulers, particularly Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, Saint Olaf, to consolidate what Harald had begun. While Norway's unification process was characterised by conflict and expansion, Denmark's political consolidation followed a somewhat different path. Already more densely populated and geographically compact than Norway, Denmark developed a more stable royal power earlier. By the early 9th century, Danish kings were significant enough to negotiate directly with the Carolingian Empire, as evidenced by diplomatic contacts between Charlemagne and King Godfred of Denmark. The mid-9th century saw Denmark temporarily weakened by internal conflicts and succession disputes, creating opportunities for ambitious chieftains to establish independence. This fragmentation contributed to the formation of the Great Heathen Army that invaded England, as various Danish leaders sought wealth and power abroad that was becoming more difficult to secure at home. The process of reunification began under Gorm the Old, Gorm den Gamle, who established control over Jutland by the early 10th century. Archaeological evidence from the massive ring fortresses at Trelleborg, Fyrkat, Aggersborg and Nonnebakken, perfect circles with precisely arranged internal buildings, suggest increasing royal power and organisational capability during this period. These structures, dated to around 980 CE, demonstrate sophisticated engineering, standardised design and the ability to mobilise substantial labour forces, all indicators of strong central authority. Gorm's son, Harald Bluetooth, Harald Blåtand, expanded Danish royal power further, extending control over parts of southern Norway and possibly portions of what is now Sweden. Around 965 CE, Harald made a decision that would profoundly alter Scandinavia's future. He officially converted to Christianity. The massive runestone he erected at Jelling commemorates this momentous shift. Harald, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The Jelling monument complex, with its enormous burial mounds, runestones and church, symbolises the transformation of Denmark from a pagan confederation to a Christian kingdom. Archaeological excavations have revealed that Harald constructed a massive ship-shaped stone setting over 350 metres long at the site, demonstrating both his resources and his desire to create an impressive royal centre that merged traditional Norse symbolism with his new Christian faith. Harald's conversion was likely motivated by a combination of political calculation and genuine religious conviction. Christianity offered advantages for a ruler seeking to strengthen central authority. It provided literate administrators, legitimised kingship through divine sanction, and facilitated closer relations with other European powers. Accepting Christianity also neutralised the threat of crusades against pagan Denmark, a growing concern as Christian Europe became more militarily assertive. The process of state formation in Sweden followed yet another pattern, influenced by its geography and position. Divided between the Svea people of Uppland in the north and the Götar of Östergötland and Västergötland in the south, early Sweden, or Svealand, lacked the geographic coherence of Denmark. Its orientation was as much eastward toward the Baltic and Russia as westward toward the North Sea. Archaeological evidence from trading centres like Birka and Helgö shows that by the 8th century, the Svea kings at Uppsala had established significant control over Baltic trade networks. The magnificent ship burials at Vendel and Valsgärde, dating from the 6th to 10th centuries, demonstrate the wealth and power of the elite that would eventually form Sweden's ruling dynasty. The first historically documented king to rule both Svea and Götar was Olaf Skotkonung, who came to power around 995 CE. Like Harald Bluetooth, Olaf converted to Christianity, being baptised around 1008 CE at Hedeby in Västergötland. Also like Harald, he began minting coins bearing his name and title, a significant indicator of royal authority and economic control. What drove this process of political consolidation across Scandinavia? Several interconnected factors contributed to the rise of stronger kingship during this period. The wealth flowing into Scandinavia from raiding, trading, and tribute created new resources for ambitious leaders to attract followers and reward loyalty. Kings who could control access to foreign wealth, whether through taxing returning raiders or monopolising certain trade routes, gained advantages over rivals. Contact with more centralised European kingdoms provided both models and incentives for Scandinavian rulers to strengthen their own authority. The threat posed by the expanding Carolingian Empire and later the Ottonian Empire encouraged political unification as a defensive measure, while diplomatic relations exposed Norse leaders to concepts of Christian kingship that emphasised centralised authority. Technological and administrative innovations, including improved shipbuilding, more effective weapons, and eventually written administration through Christianity, enabled rulers to project power more efficiently across their territories. Religious change, particularly the gradual conversion to Christianity, provided kings with new sources of legitimacy and administrative tools. Christian ideology supported the concept of a single ruler, divinely sanctioned to govern his people, a significant shift from traditional Norse concepts of kingship based primarily on personal prowess and success in war. The process of state formation transformed not just political structures, but the entire society. As kings consolidated power, they established more regular taxation, created administrative districts, minted coins, promulgated laws applicable to their entire realms, and began to define territorial boundaries more precisely. The fluid, kinship-based power networks of the early Viking Age gradually gave way to more territorial conceptions of authority. This transformation didn't happen overnight, nor was it uncontested. Throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, Scandinavian kings faced resistance from regional elites accustomed to independence, religious conservatives opposed to Christianity, and rival claimants to royal power. The sagas record numerous rebellions, usurpations, and conflicts that complicated the path towards centralised kingdoms. Nevertheless, by the end of the Viking Age, the political landscape of Scandinavia had been fundamentally altered. The fragmented chieftaincies of the 8th century had consolidated into 3 recognisable kingdoms: Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, each with established royal dynasties, administrative structures, and increasingly Christian identities. These emerging states would project power in new ways, sponsoring larger and more organised overseas expeditions, and eventually establishing short-lived empires across the North Sea and Baltic regions. While the western expansion of the Vikings into Britain, Ireland, and the North Atlantic has dominated popular accounts, equally significant was their eastward movement along the rivers of Eastern Europe. This less familiar chapter of Viking history involved different actors, strategies, and outcomes, yet proved just as consequential for European development. The eastern expansion followed a fundamentally different pattern from the western raids. Instead of coastal attacks on wealthy religious centres, the eastern Vikings, primarily Swedes known as Russes or Varangians, established trade routes along the major river systems of Eastern Europe, founded or dominated urban centres, and eventually created political structures that would evolve into the medieval Russian state. This eastern activity began earlier than is often recognised. Archaeological evidence from Staraya Ladoga, near Lake Ladoga in northwestern Russia, confirms a Scandinavian presence by the mid-8th century, predating the Lindisfarne raid. This settlement, called Aldigjuborg by the Norse, served as a gateway between the Baltic and the interior river systems of Russia. excavations have yielded Scandinavian artifacts, including weapons, jewellery, and runestones, alongside Slavic, Baltic, and Finnic materials, evidence of a multicultural trading community. The geography of Eastern Europe, with its interconnected river systems, created natural highways for trade and expansion. From the Baltic, Swedish Vikings could enter the Gulf of Finland, then access the Neva River leading to Lake Ladoga. From there, the Folkov River led south toward Lake Ilmen and Novgorod. Portaging their ships between river systems, they could reach the headwaters of the Dnieper flowing to the Black Sea, or the Volga leading to the Caspian. This riverine network connected the fur-rich forests of the north with the wealthy markets of Byzantium and the Islamic world, a commercial opportunity that Scandinavian traders were uniquely positioned to exploit with their shallow draft vessels and maritime expertise. The paradox that defines the Eastern Viking expansion is that these foreign warriors simultaneously served as both disruptive raiders and state-building founders. How could the same groups that appeared as threatening outsiders in some contexts become the organising elites in others? The answer lies in the political and economic conditions they encountered in Eastern Europe. Unlike Western Europe, with its legacy of Roman administration and Christian ecclesiastical structures, the territories of what would become Russia were politically fragmented among various Slavic, Baltic, and Finnic peoples. The primary chronicle, a medieval Kievan text, describes a situation of tribal conflict that created an opening for external leadership. They said to themselves, "Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law." They accordingly went overseas to the Varangian Rus. They said to the Rus, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." While this account written centuries later certainly simplifies and mythologizes the process, archaeological and linguistic evidence confirms that Scandinavian elites did establish themselves as rulers over predominantly Slavic populations in key centres along the trade routes. The most significant of these Scandinavian leaders was Rurik, who according to tradition established himself at Novgorod around 862 CE. Whether invited or imposing himself through force, Rurik became the founder of the dynasty that would rule the emerging Russia's state for centuries. His successors, particularly Oleg, Old Norse Helgi, expanded their control southward, capturing Kiev around 882 CE and establishing it as the new centre of what would become Kievan Russes. Archaeological evidence from urban centres along these river routes reveals the multicultural nature of early Russes society. At Gnezdovo near Smolensk, excavations have uncovered one of Eastern Europe's largest complexes of burial mounds, containing both Scandinavian and Slavic graves. The artefacts found there, including Thor's hammer amulets, Arabic coins, Byzantine jewellery, and weapons of Scandinavian design, demonstrate the international connections maintained by these communities. The material culture shows a gradual blending of Norse and Slavic elements over time. Early settlements and burials display distinctively Scandinavian characteristics, but by the late 10th century, these markers become less pronounced as the Varangian elites progressively adopted local languages and customs while maintaining their trade connections and some cultural distinctions. The interactions between Scandinavian newcomers and the indigenous peoples of the region, primarily Slavic tribes but also Baltic and Finnic groups, varied by location and time period. In some areas, particularly major trading centres, evidence suggests relatively peaceful coexistence and gradual integration. In others, fortifications and weapons finds indicate more conflictual relationships. What made the Rus Vikings particularly effective in this environment was their ability to operate as both merchants and warriors as circumstances required. The same skills that made them formidable raiders in the West, naval mobility, effective weaponry, and organisational capability, allowed them to control key points along the eastern trade routes and extract tribute from surrounding populations. The primary chronicle describes how the early Rus's rulers collected tribute in furs, honey and slaves from Slavic and Finnic tribes, using these resources to finance their commercial and military operations. Archaeological evidence confirms this economic pattern, with concentrations of foreign coins and luxury goods at centres of Russ's power. The material evidence of this eastern trade is impressive. Excavations across Scandinavia, particularly on Gotland, have yielded over 200,000 Arabic silver coins, dirhams, dating from the 8th to 11th centuries. These finds, along with Byzantine silks, Caucasian glassware, and other Eastern luxury goods, demonstrate the scale and significance of this commerce. The most vivid written account of the Eastern Vikings comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered Russ's traders along the Volga River in 922 CE. His detailed description provides a rare outsider's perspective on these Scandinavian merchants operating deep in Eastern territory. "I've seen the Russ as they came on their merchant journeys, and were encamped by the Volga. I've never seen more perfect physical specimens, tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy. Each man has an axe, a sword, and a knife, and keeps each by him at all times. Each woman wears on either breast a box of iron, silver, copper, or gold. Around their necks they wear bands of gold and silver." Ibn Fadlan's account, while containing elements of cultural misunderstanding and exaggeration, offers valuable insights into Russ's appearance, customs, religious practices, and commercial activities. He describes their ritual washing, their elaborate funerary practices, including a ship cremation of a chieftain, and their trading methods, all details that complement the archaeological record. The Eastern Vikings established or developed a string of urban centres along their trade routes. Beyond Staraya Ladoga and Novgorod in the north, important settlements included Polotsk, Smolensk, Chernigov, and ultimately Kiev, which became the centre of the Russ's state by the early 10th century. These towns functioned as collection points for tribute, manufacturing centres for processed goods, and transfer points for long-distance trade. What began as trading posts gradually evolved into more complex urban centres with diverse populations. Archaeological evidence shows craft specialisation, with workshops producing jewellery, weapons, glassware and textiles. The layout of these early towns typically featured a fortified centre, Detonets, later called Kremlin, housing the prince and elite, surrounded by a commercial district where craftspeople and merchants lived and worked. By the mid-10th century, the Rus had established regular trading connections with the Byzantine Empire, conducting annual trading expeditions down the Dnieper to Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine Porphyrogenitus, describes these journeys in detail in his De Administrando Imperio, explaining how the Russes assembled fleets of monoxyla, dugout boats, each spring, navigated the dangerous Dnieper rapids, and conducted trade under carefully regulated conditions in Constantinople. These commercial expeditions occasionally turned to military adventures. In 860, 907, and 941 CE, Russ's fleets attacked Constantinople itself, though with limited success against the city's formidable defences. More effective was their raiding along the Black Sea coasts, where Byzantine provincial towns proved more vulnerable. The Caspian Sea region also suffered Rus raids, with major expeditions recorded in 913 and 943 targeting wealthy Islamic cities along its shores. The relationship between the Rus and their eastern trading partners was complex and evolving, initially appearing as dangerous raiders and hard bargaining merchants. By the late 10th century, the Rus had become integrated into regional diplomatic networks. The marriage of Vladimir the Great of Kiev to the Byzantine princess Anna in 989 symbolised this transformation from outsiders to recognised players in the medieval Eastern world. As the 10th century progressed, the Scandinavian character of the Rus elite gradually diminished through intermarriage with Slavic families and cultural assimilation. Vladimir's conversion to Orthodox Christianity in 988 CE accelerated this process, aligning the Rus' state more firmly with Byzantine cultural influence rather than its Norse roots. Nevertheless, connections with Scandinavia persisted, archaeological evidence shows continued trade between Russ's territories and Sweden into the 11th century. Scandinavian mercenaries remained important in Russ's military forces, and dynastic marriages occasionally renewed the northern connection. As late as 1019, Yaroslav the Wise secured his position as Grand Prince of Kiev, with the help of Swedish warriors provided by his father-in-law, King Olof Skutkonung. The legacy of this Viking Age interaction would be profound and enduring. The very name Russia derives from Rus, originally referring to the Scandinavian traders and warriors. The first East Slavic state emerged under Varangian leadership, establishing political structures that would influence Russian development for centuries. Trade routes pioneered during this period connected northern Europe with Central Asia and the Middle East, facilitating cultural and economic exchange across vast distances. Yet unlike in parts of the British Isles, where Norse language and customs left a heavy imprint, the Scandinavian contribution to Russian culture was primarily organisational and political, rather than linguistic or religious. The relatively small numbers of Varangians were gradually absorbed into the much larger Slavic population, leaving subtle traces in vocabulary, legal concepts and elite military traditions, rather than transforming the fundamental character of East Slavic society. The most ambitious Viking expeditions reached far beyond the Baltic into the glittering civilizations of Byzantium and the Islamic world. These journeys, covering thousands of miles through hostile territory, represent some of history's most remarkable commercial ventures, connecting the remote forests of the north with the sophisticated urban centres of the Mediterranean and Middle East. No destination held more fascination for the Norsemen than Constantinople, Miklagard, Great City, in their sagas. The capital of the Byzantine Empire was the largest and wealthiest city in Christian Europe, with a population exceeding 300,000 when most Western European towns counted their inhabitants in mere thousands. Its massive walls, monumental architecture, mechanical wonders, and accumulated treasures made it the marvel of the medieval world. The first recorded Russ's attack on Constantinople came in 860 CE, when a fleet appeared suddenly before the city, taking advantage of the absence of the Byzantine fleet on campaign elsewhere. Though this raid failed to breach the city's formidable defences, it announced the arrival of a new power in the Black Sea region, and began a complex relationship that would evolve from hostility to alliance. Subsequent expeditions in 907 and 941 similarly failed to capture the city, but demonstrated the Rus' capacity to project power over enormous distances. The 907th expedition, led by Prince Oleg according to the primary chronicle, allegedly involved 2,000 ships, certainly an exaggeration but indicating a substantial force. The chronicle claims Oleg mounted his shield on Constantinople's gate as a symbol of victory, though Byzantine sources don't confirm this dramatic gesture. What these military expeditions did achieve was forcing the Byzantines to negotiate commercial treaties. Agreements concluded in 907, 911, and 945 established the terms under which Russ's merchants could trade in Constantinople. These remarkably detailed documents, preserved in the primary chronicle, regulated everything from the number of merchants allowed to enter the city, limited to 50 at a time, to their accommodations in the St. Mama's Quarter, outside the walls, to the diplomatic immunities they enjoyed. The most dramatic development in Byzantine-Russ's relations came when some Vikings transitioned from occasional raiders to trusted imperial guardsmen. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine army, composed primarily of Scandinavian warriors, became the emperor's personal bodyguard and one of the most prestigious military forces in the medieval world. The Guard's formation is traditionally attributed to an agreement between Emperor Basil II and Vladimir I of Kiev in 988, when Vladimir provided 6,000 warriors to help Basil defeat a rebellion. Impressed by their loyalty and fighting prowess, the emperor retained these Northmen as his personal guard, beginning an institution that would last for centuries. service in the Varangian Guard offered unprecedented opportunities for Scandinavian warriors. The pay was exceptional. Byzantine military salaries far exceeded anything available in the north. The prestige was immense, guarding the most powerful Christian ruler in the world. Perhaps most attractive was the possibility of participating in the emperor's spoils system. When a new emperor took power or achieved major victories, the Guard received ceremonial distributions of gold, while successful campaigns offered opportunities for plunder and ransoms. Archaeological evidence of this service appears across Scandinavia in the form of Byzantine coins, jewellery, silks and religious objects brought home by returning guardsmen. Runestones in Sweden commemorate men who served in the south. One from Pilgårds on Gotland states simply, "They fared like men far after gold, and in the east gave food to the eagle." They died in the south in Sörkland, the Islamic territories. The most famous Varangian was Harald Sigurdsson, later known as Harald Hardrada, Hard Ruler, King of Norway. After fleeing Norway as a teenager following his half-brother's defeat, Harald spent years in Russi's and then Byzantine service, participating in campaigns from Sicily to the Holy Land. Byzantine sources describe his exploits, including his clever capture of a Sicilian city by having his men request permission to bury a dead commander inside the walls. The corpse then springing to life to open the gates. Harald eventually returned to Norway with enormous wealth, acquired during his Byzantine service. According to the sagas, he had to use multiple ships to transport his treasure, which included not just gold and silver but silks, jewellery, and exotic weapons. This wealth funded his successful bid for the Norwegian throne and his subsequent campaigns, including his final fatal invasion of England in 1066. While Constantinople attracted Norse warriors seeking service in the prestigious Varangian Guard, the Islamic world drew Viking merchants pursuing commercial opportunities. The Abbasid Caliphate centred in Baghdad and the competing Umayyad Caliphate in Spain represented the height of early medieval civilization, with sophisticated economies, advanced scholarship, and demand for northern products like furs, amber, honey, and slaves. The primary route to the Islamic lands followed the Volga River to the Caspian Sea, from which merchants could reach the wealthy cities of Persia and Central Asia. Archaeological evidence of this trade appears in the form of hundreds of thousands of Islamic silver coins, dirhams, found across Scandinavia and the Baltic region, particularly concentrated on the Swedish island of Gotland. The scale of this commerce was enormous. A single hoard discovered at Spillings on Gotland contained over 14,000 silver coins, primarily from Islamic mints, along with silver ingots and jewellery, the largest Viking Age silver treasure ever found. Analysis of these coin finds shows they originated from mints throughout the Islamic world, from Spain and North Africa to Afghanistan and Central Asia, demonstrating the extent of these trading networks. Ibn Fadlan's famous account provides our most detailed view of Rus's traders operating in Islamic territory. Sent as an emissary from the Abbasid Caliph to the Volga Bulgars in 922 CEE, he encountered Rus's merchants along the Volga and recorded his observations with ethnographic precision. His description of a chieftain's funeral is particularly valuable, detailing an elaborate ship cremation that included animal sacrifices and the voluntary death of a slave girl. Practices known from archaeological evidence, but rarely described in such detail. While Ibn Fadlan's account is generally credible, his perspective as an urbane Muslim diplomat, observing what he considered primitive foreigners, colours his descriptions. He expresses particular disgust at what he perceived as Viking lack of hygiene. Though ironically, his description of their daily washing routine suggests they were actually more concerned with cleanliness than many of their European contemporaries. Other Arabic sources provide additional perspectives on these Norse visitors. The geographer Ibn Khurradadbi, writing around 870 CE, describes Rus merchants bringing beaver and fox furs and swords to Baghdad, noting that they claimed to be Christians to pay lower taxes, though most were still pagans at this time. The diplomat or Ibn Roesdahl comments on their physical appearance, their island dwelling, likely referring to settlements in Lake Ladoga, and their raids on Slavic peoples. The goods flowing southward through these trade routes included furs, honey, wax, amber, and slaves, the latter being particularly valuable in Islamic markets where demand for labour and military recruits was high. In return, the Rus received silver coins, spices, silks, glassware, and other luxury items unavailable in Northern Europe. This commerce profoundly impacted Scandinavian economies and societies. The influx of silver provided a medium of exchange more portable and divisible than traditional forms of wealth like land or livestock. Islamic weights and measures influenced Scandinavian economic practices, with some Viking Age weights clearly based on Islamic standards. Luxury goods from the south enhanced the prestige of chieftains and kings who could acquire and distribute them, reinforcing social hierarchies. The cultural exchange worked in both directions. Islamic silver was often converted into jewellery, incorporating Norse designs. Arabic coins were sometimes adapted as pendants or decorative elements. Occasionally, Islamic motifs appear in Scandinavian art, showing aesthetic appreciation transcending religious differences. The flow of Eastern silver into Scandinavia declined sharply after about 970 CE, when political instability in the Islamic world disrupted the trade routes and silver mining. This silver crisis coincided with other changes in the Viking world, including increasing Christianization and political centralization, contributing to the transformation of Scandinavian societies in the late Viking Age. Both Byzantine and Islamic sources express ambivalence about their Norse visitors, admiring their physical prowess and commercial acumen, while viewing them as culturally inferior barbarians. This perspective contrasts with Western European accounts that emphasise Viking violence and paganism. In the cosmopolitan East, religious difference was less shocking, and commercial pragmatism often trumped cultural prejudice. For the Vikings themselves, these eastern journeys offered not just material wealth, but exposure to advanced civilizations that would influence their own cultural development. Returning travellers brought back not only silver and silks, but new ideas, technologies, and artistic motifs. The Byzantine influence would be particularly significant following the Christianization of Rus and Scandinavia, with Orthodox models shaping early Russian church architecture and religious practices. The legacy of these Eastern connections would be lasting. Trade routes established during the Viking Age created enduring economic networks linking Northern Europe with the Mediterranean and Central Asia. The political structures developed by the Rus laid foundations for the medieval Russian state. Cultural and artistic influences flowed along these routes, contributing to the distinctive synthesis of Norse, Slavic, Byzantine, and Islamic elements that characterized medieval Eastern European civilization. While some Vikings ventured east along the Russian rivers, others sailed west into the vast, uncharted waters of the North Atlantic. This westward expansion, perhaps the most astonishing feat of Viking Age exploration, led to the discovery and settlement of previously uninhabited lands and ultimately to the shores of North America itself. The North Atlantic expansion followed a stepping stone pattern, with each new discovery building on previous knowledge. From their Norwegian homeland, Norse sailors first reached the Shetland and Orkney Islands, already inhabited but transformed by Scandinavian settlement. From there they pushed westward to the Faroe Islands, then Iceland, Greenland, and finally, briefly, to North America. Each step requiring longer open ocean voyages into increasingly challenging environments. The Faroe Islands, located roughly halfway between Norway and Iceland, represent the first truly significant Norse expansion into previously uninhabited territory. These windswept islands, rising dramatically from the North Atlantic, were discovered by Irish monks seeking isolation for their ascetic practices. But Norse settlement from the early 9th century quickly displaced or absorbed this small monastic presence. The timing of this settlement is confirmed by both written sources and environmental evidence. The Feringa saga, though compiled centuries later, describes the initial settlement under the leadership of Graham-Campbell. More compelling scientific evidence comes from lake sediment cores, showing a sudden increase in erosion and the appearance of non-native plant species precisely during this period. The arrival of sheep and cattle, accompanied by land clearance, left a clear environmental signature, marking the beginning of human impact on the landscape. Archaeological excavations at sites like Toftanes reveal the typical pattern of Norse settlement. Longhouses built of stone and turf due to the scarcity of timber, with interior arrangements similar to those in Norway. The economy focused on sheep raising, supplemented by fishing, seabird harvesting, and limited barley cultivation in the more sheltered valleys. The difficult environment required adaptation of Norwegian farming practices, foreshadowing the challenges settlers would face in more extreme locations. The Faroes settlement succeeded because it matched the carrying capacity of the environment. With a relatively small population practicing mixed subsistence strategies well suited to the island's resources, the Faroes established a sustainable society that has maintained continuous habitation to the present day. This success stands in marked contrast to later settlements in more challenging environments, where environmental miscalculations would prove fatal. Iceland represented the next and much larger step in Norse Atlantic expansion. Located at the edge of the habitable world, with its interior dominated by glaciers, active volcanoes and barren highlands, Iceland nonetheless offered coastal lowlands suitable for the Norse pastoral economy. Its discovery and settlement constitute one of the best documented colonisation events of the pre-modern era, thanks to remarkably detailed medieval Icelandic sources. According to Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, Iceland was discovered accidentally by a Norwegian named Naddod, who was blown off course while sailing to the Faroes. Other early explorers followed, including Garda Svavarsson, who circumnavigated the island, and Flokki Vilgerdarsson, who gave Iceland its name after seeing drift ice in a fjord. The systematic settlement Landnám began around 874 CE, with the arrival of Ingolfur Arnarsson, traditionally considered Iceland's first permanent settler. What followed was one of history's most rapid colonisation events. Within 60 years, most of Iceland's habitable land had been claimed by settlers arriving primarily from Norway, but also from Norse colonies in the British Isles. The latter brought with them Celtic wives, slaves, and cultural influences, creating a more diverse society than is sometimes recognised. Genetic studies of modern Icelanders confirm this mixed heritage, showing significant Celtic maternal ancestry alongside predominantly Norse paternal lineage. Why did thousands of people abandon their homelands for this remote island? Political developments in Scandinavia, particularly Harald Fairhair's unification of Norway, certainly played a role. Many early settlers were chieftains, and their followers fleeing Harald's increasing authority. Economic factors also contributed. Iceland offered land ownership opportunities for those facing limited prospects at home. The sagas emphasise individual motivations, ranging from blood feuds to simple wanderlust, painting a complex picture of push and pull factors driving migration. Iceland's settlement occurred during an unusually favourable climatic period, with temperatures warmer than today. This medieval warm period made agriculture more viable than it would later become, encouraging optimistic assessments of the island's carrying capacity. Nevertheless, settlers quickly discovered the environment's limitations. The thin soils and short growing season restricted grain cultivation, while the absence of native forests led to rapid deforestation as trees were cut for construction, fuel, and charcoal production. The archaeological record reveals how settlers adapted to these constraints. At sites like Hofstadir and Stung, excavations show farmsteads built primarily of turf and stone, with internal layouts modified from Norwegian models to conserve heat. Faunal remains demonstrate a shift in livestock ratios, with sheep becoming increasingly dominant over the more environmentally demanding cattle. Fishing, initially supplementary, grew more important as the limitations of pastoralism became apparent. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Icelandic settlement was its political organisation. Finding themselves beyond the reach of any established kingdom, the settlers created what some historians have described as the world's first parliamentary democracy, though aristocratic republic might be more accurate. The Althing, established around 930 CE, brought representatives from across Iceland together annually at Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates visibly separate. This assembly combined legislative, judicial, and social functions. Laws were recited from memory by the law speaker, disputes were adjudicated, marriages arranged, and alliances formed. The island was divided into quarters, each with regional assemblies, Varthing, handling local matters. While political power remained concentrated among wealthy landowners, Godar, the system provided mechanisms for dispute resolution that prevented the constant warfare that might have made survival impossible in such a marginal environment. Iceland's isolation fostered a unique cultural flowering. The oral traditions brought by settlers, poems, histories and sagas, were eventually preserved in writing following Christianization around 1000 CE. This literature, composed in Old Norse rather than Latin, represents one of the most important vernacular literary traditions of medieval Europe. Works like Njal's Saga, Egil's Saga, and the poetic Edda provide unparalleled insights into Norse culture while demonstrating sophisticated narrative techniques and psychological depth that continue to influence literature today. As remarkable as Iceland's settlement was, the colonisation of Greenland pushed the limits of Norse adaptation even further. Around 985 CE, Eric the Red led a fleet of settlers from Iceland to the southwestern coast of Greenland, establishing two main settlements: the eastern settlement in modern Qaqortoq district, and the smaller western settlement near present-day Nuuk. A third, smaller middle settlement developed between them. Eric's expedition followed his exploration of Greenland during a 3-year exile from Iceland, imposed as punishment for killings. According to Eric's saga, he deliberately named the ice-covered land Greenland to attract settlers, an early example of misleading real estate marketing. While the name was certainly optimistic, the southwestern coastal areas were indeed greener than much of Iceland, with fjords offering sheltered locations for farms. Archaeological excavations at sites like Brata Lid, Eric's own farm, and Gardar, the episcopal seat after Christianization, reveal substantial settlements with stone and turf buildings, including churches, barns and longhouses similar to those in Iceland. At its peak in the 13th century, the Greenland colony numbered perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people, living on several hundred farms, maintaining a Norse-European identity at the very edge of the habitable world. The Greenland economy relied on a combination of livestock raising, hunting and trading. Cattle, sheep and goats provided the foundation of subsistence, supplemented by hunting seals, caribou and polar bears. Trade with Europe focused on luxury goods like walrus ivory, polar bear pelts and live falcons, exchanged for essential imports including iron, timber and grain. Recent archaeological research has significantly revised our understanding of the Greenlanders' adaptation strategies. Earlier views portrayed them as stubbornly clinging to inappropriate European farming methods. New evidence shows they actually made substantial adaptations, shifting their diet to include more marine mammals, particularly seals, as climate conditions worsened. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains indicates that marine foods eventually constituted up to 80% of their diet, a significant departure from traditional Norse patterns. The Greenland settlements maintained contact with Iceland and Europe through occasional trading voyages, though these became increasingly irregular as the Middle Ages progressed. The colony received a bishop residing at Garda and built impressive stone churches, including a cathedral whose ruins still stand. They paid tithes to the Norwegian crown and the church in the form of walrus ivory and other Arctic products, maintaining their identity as an outpost of European Christendom. Despite these adaptations and connections, the Greenland colony ultimately failed. The western settlement was abandoned around 1350, while the eastern settlement persisted until approximately 1450, before disappearing from European records. The colony's demise has generated extensive scholarly debate, with multiple factors likely contributing to this complex historical event. Climate change played a significant role. The medieval warm period that facilitated initial settlement gave way to the Little Ice Age, beginning around 1300. Cooling temperatures shortened growing seasons, increased sea ice that blocked harbours, and made livestock raising increasingly difficult. Paleoclimatic evidence from ice cores confirms this deterioration in conditions precisely when the settlements were struggling. Economic factors also contributed. The European market for walrus ivory collapsed as elephant ivory from Africa became more available. Without these valuable trade goods, Greenland lost its ability to import essential supplies. Declining trade meant fewer ships making the dangerous voyage, increasing the colony's isolation. Social and cultural factors may have limited adaptation. Despite adopting some hunting practices, the Norse apparently never fully embraced Inuit technologies like the kayak and toggle harpoon that might have improved their chances of survival. Evidence of contact between Norse and Inuit exists, but relations appear to have been primarily hostile rather than cooperative, preventing beneficial cultural exchange. Finally, demographic challenges including outmigration, declining birth rates, and possibly disease contributed to the settlement's vulnerability. With a small population already living at the margins of survival, any additional stresses could prove catastrophic. The abandonment of the Greenland settlements marked the first major reversal in Norse Atlantic expansion, a sobering demonstration that there were indeed limits to their remarkable adaptability. Yet even as Greenland's colonies struggled, Norse explorers had already pushed even further west, reaching the shores of North America itself. The Norse discovery of North America represents one of history's most remarkable exploration achievements, reaching a new continent without charts, compasses, or any prior knowledge of its existence. Yet this momentous discovery, occurring around the year 1000 CE, would ultimately prove transient, with attempted settlements failing within a few years, and the knowledge of these western lands fading into legend until archaeological confirmation in the 20th century. According to the Vinland sagas, primarily Erik's saga and the saga of the Greenlanders, the first European to sight North American shores was Bjarni Herjolfsson, who was blown off course while sailing from Iceland to Greenland around 985 to 986 CE. Bjarni reportedly saw forested coastlines to the west, but did not land, continuing instead to Greenland, where he described his discovery. The first deliberate exploration followed some 15 years later, led by Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. Purchasing Bjarni's ship and assembling a crew of 35 men, Leif retraced the accidental discovery, this time making landfalls. The sagas describe 3 distinct regions encountered during this voyage: Helluland, Flatstone Land, likely Baffin Island; Markland, Forest Land; Land, probably Labrador; and finally Vinland, Wineland or perhaps Meadowland, the most hospitable region where they established a temporary camp. Leif's expedition discovered wild grapes, or perhaps berries, salmon-filled rivers, and meadows with grass sufficient for livestock, resources that appeared abundant compared to Greenland's marginal environment. The mild winter allowed them to survive comfortably before returning to Greenland, with their ship loaded with timber and vine-related products. News of these discoveries prompted further expeditions. Leif's brother Thorvald led the next voyage, but was killed in a skirmish with indigenous people the Norse called Skrælings, likely either Beothuk or Innu people. A more ambitious colonisation attempt followed under the wealthy Icelandic merchant Thorfinn Karlsefni, who led a group of about 60 men and 5 women with livestock and supplies intended for permanent settlement. Karlsefni's expedition established a settlement and initially traded with indigenous people, exchanging red cloth for furs. However, relations deteriorated after a bull belonging to the Norse frightened the natives, leading to armed conflict. Despite the Norse technological advantages in weapons, the numerical superiority of the indigenous population made the settlement's position untenable. After 3 years of intermittent conflict and the birth of the first European child in the Americas, Snorri Thorfinnsson, the colonists abandoned their settlement and returned to Greenland. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed by historians as mere legends or literary inventions. The breakthrough came in 1960 when Norwegian archaeologists Helge and Anstein Ingstad discovered undeniably Norse ruins at Lonsø Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Excavations revealed 8 buildings constructed in the typical Norse style, with turf walls and wooden frames, including a large hall, smaller residential structures, workshops, and a smithy. Artefacts recovered from the site confirmed its Norse origin beyond any doubt. A bronze pin of Scandinavian design, a soapstone spindle whirl, and iron boat rivets identical to those used in Viking ships. Radiocarbon dating placed the settlement precisely in the period described by the sagas, around 1000 CE. Later excavations identified evidence of metalworking, carpentry, and boat repair activities. The Lonsø Meadows site represents the first confirmed European presence in the Americas, predating Columbus by nearly 500 years. However, its scale and duration were limited. Archaeological evidence suggests occupation lasting perhaps 10 to 25 years at most, with a population of 70 to 90 people. During peak activity, the settlement appears to have functioned primarily as a winter-based camp and repair station, supporting further exploration, rather than as a self-sustaining colony. The exact relationship between Lonsø Meadows and the Finland described in the sagas remains debated. The site itself doesn't match all the saga descriptions. It lacks the wild grapes or self-sown wheat mentioned in the texts. Most scholars now believe Lonsø Meadows served as a gateway settlement, with the more hospitable Vinland, proper located further south, perhaps in the Gulf of St. Lawrence region, or even as far as New England, where wild grapes do grow naturally. Recent archaeological investigations have searched for evidence of additional Norse sites further south, but despite occasional intriguing findings, no other location has been confirmed with the same certainty as Lonsø Meadows. Possible Norse artefacts have been reported from Maine to Rhode Island, but none in context that definitively establish a Norse presence. What if the Norse settlements had succeeded? This tantalising counterfactual has fascinated historians and fiction writers alike. A permanent Norse presence in North America might have dramatically altered the continent's history, potentially creating a Norse indigenous hybrid culture, or establishing European outposts centuries before Columbus. Technology, livestock, and possibly disease might have spread earlier, with unpredictable consequences for indigenous societies. Yet the failure of these settlements reveals the practical limits of Norse expansion. Several factors contributed to their inability to establish permanent footholds in North America. Demographics played a crucial role. The Norse simply lacked the population base to sustain distant colonies, especially when facing numerous indigenous peoples. With the total population of Greenland numbering only a few thousand at its peak, sparing dozens of settlers for a risky venture across the Davis Strait stretched their resources to the breaking point. Distance and logistics created nearly insurmountable challenges. The voyage from Greenland to Vinland was long and dangerous, making regular supply or reinforcement difficult. Unlike their eastern expansion, where river systems provided natural highways into continental interiors, the North American coast offered no such easy access to resources beyond the immediate shoreline. Indigenous resistance proved decisive. Unlike Iceland and Greenland, which were either uninhabited or very sparsely populated, North America contained established societies capable of mounting effective opposition to newcomers. The sagas describe the Norse technological advantages in weapons and armour, but these were offset by the natives' superior numbers and knowledge of the terrain. Economic incentives were insufficient to justify the risks. While timber was valuable to the wood-starved Greenlanders, the difficulty of transporting it back to Greenland limited its utility. Other resources discovered in Vinland, while promising, didn't offer the immediate wealth that might have motivated larger colonisation efforts. the Greenland colony itself was struggling for survival by the time written records of Vinland faded. With their own position becoming precarious due to climate change and economic isolation, Greenlanders couldn't spare the resources for speculative ventures further west. Knowledge of these western lands didn't entirely disappear from European awareness. Icelandic annals record a ship arriving from Markland in 1347, suggesting occasional voyages continued long after the settlement attempts had failed. Hints of this knowledge may have influenced later explorers, with some scholars suggesting Columbus might have heard rumours of western lands during a visit to Iceland in 1477, though direct evidence for this is lacking. The Norse discovery of America represents both the high watermark of Viking exploration and the point where their expansion reached its natural limits. It demonstrated their extraordinary maritime capabilities while simultaneously revealing the constraints that would ultimately confine their permanent influence to the North Atlantic and Baltic regions. The roles and status of women in Viking society present one of the most intriguing paradoxes of the period. Within a culture celebrated for masculine warrior values, women enjoyed legal rights, economic opportunities, and social positions that were remarkably progressive compared to much of contemporary Europe. Yet these freedoms existed within a framework that still defined women primarily through their family relationships and household responsibilities. To understand Viking women's lives, we must first examine their legal standing. Scandinavian law codes, while primarily recorded after the Viking Age, preserve older traditions that granted women significant rights. Unlike women in much of medieval Europe, Norse women could own property independently, inherit from parents and deceased husbands, and manage their own finances. A woman's dowry remained her property throughout marriage, and in case of divorce, which women could initiate under certain conditions, she was entitled to reclaim these assets along with a share of common property. These property rights gave women economic leverage and a degree of independence rare for the era. Archaeological evidence from female graves confirms this economic agency, with women often buried with keys symbolising their control over household goods and storerooms, scales for weighing silver, and occasionally merchant tools suggesting direct involvement in trade. Marriage in Viking society functioned as both a personal relationship and a political economic alliance between families. While parents negotiated most marriages, women weren't entirely without voice in the matter. The sagas depict women refusing unsuitable matches or setting conditions for acceptance. Once married, women typically moved to their husband's household, but maintained connections with their birth families who could intervene if they were mistreated. Divorce procedures were remarkably straightforward by medieval standards. A woman could declare herself divorced simply by calling witnesses and stating her reasons, which could include physical abuse, failure to provide support, or even the husband wearing women's clothes. After divorce, children typically remained with the father's family, though arrangements varied based on circumstances and local customs. The most dramatic evidence of women's legal standing comes from the Icelandic law code Gragas, which imposed severe penalties for violating a woman's honour or autonomy. A man could be outlawed, effectively sentenced to death, for forcing a kiss on an unwilling woman. Such protections, while not always enforced in practice, indicate a society that recognised women's right to control their own bodies to a degree unusual for the period. The daily responsibilities of Viking women centred on the household, but this domestic sphere encompassed far more than modern connotations might suggest. Women managed complex economic operations that included food production, textile manufacturing, dairy processing, brewing, and food preservation, all critical to survival in the challenging northern environment. Textile production in particular represented a major economic activity and source of female prestige. Archaeological sites invariably yield evidence of spinning and weaving, spindle whorls, loom weights, needles, and fabric fragments. Creating wool cloth was a time-intensive process, from shearing sheep through spinning, dyeing, and weaving. A single sail for a Viking ship required the wool from more than 200 sheep and thousands of hours of women's labour, making textile production as strategically important as shipbuilding itself. Women's domestic authority was particularly crucial given men's frequent absences. With husbands away on trading expeditions, Viking raids or fishing trips that could last months or even years, women ran farms and businesses, made economic decisions, and represented family interests in local matters. This practical necessity of independence shaped both social expectations and legal frameworks. Beyond these universal female roles, the archaeological record reveals women who stepped outside traditional gender boundaries. The controversial Birka warrior grave in Sweden, burial BJ581, contained a body biologically female, but buried with a full set of weapons, 2 sacrificed horses, and tactical board game pieces suggesting military command. This discovery, confirmed by DNA analysis in 2017, has forced reconsideration of women's potential roles in Viking society. While female warriors were likely exceptional rather than commonplace, literary sources provide additional context for such possibilities. The semi-mythological shield maidens appear in sagas and poems, while historical sources mention women like Lagertha, celebrated in Saxo Grammaticus's history, who reportedly fought alongside men. Whether these represent historical reality, literary invention, or something in between remains debated, but they suggest a cultural framework where female martial activity, while unusual, wasn't unthinkable. More common than female warriors were women who exercised power through religious roles. Before Christianization, women served as völur, singular völva, seers and practitioners of cedar, a form of magic particularly associated with females. Archaeological evidence for such practitioners comes from distinctive graves containing staffs, amulets, and unusual herbs or potions. The Oseberg ship burial, one of the richest Viking Age graves ever discovered, may have contained such a religious specialist, along with her elaborate ritual equipment. The sagas describe these seers travelling between settlements, conducting ceremonies, entering trance states to communicate with spirits, and making prophecies that influenced major decisions. Their abilities to foretell the future, influence fertility, and potentially harm enemies through magic gave them significant social power, transcending normal gender limitations. The introduction of Christianity gradually restricted these religious leadership opportunities, as the new faith reserved priestly functions for men. However, women played crucial roles in the conversion process itself, often adopting Christianity before their husbands and influencing family religious practices. Once established, the church offered new roles for elite women as patrons of religious institutions, and in some cases as abbesses of wealthy convents. Social status affected women's opportunities and constraints more than gender alone. Elite women commanded servants and slaves, influenced political decisions through their male relatives, and sometimes ruled estates or even territories when male kin were absent. The sagas depict powerful women like Aud the Deep-Minded, who led a migration to Iceland and established a dynasty, or Freydis Eiriksdottir, who travelled to Vinland and allegedly took command during a conflict with indigenous people. At the opposite social extreme, female slaves, thralls, faced harsh conditions with few legal protections. Captured in raids or born into servitude, these women performed the most demanding physical labour and were vulnerable to sexual exploitation. The Ibn Fadlan account graphically describes a slave girl ritually sacrificed during a chieftain's funeral, an extreme example of female thralls' lack of bodily autonomy. Between these extremes, most free women occupied positions that combined significant household authority with clear gender expectations. They were valued for skills in textile production, food preparation, medical knowledge, and child rearing, while also expected to maintain family honour, sometimes by goading male relatives toward violent revenge when that honour was threatened. The archaeological evidence for women's lives comes primarily from grave goods, which show both gender differentiation and significant overlap. Typically, women were buried with domestic implements, jewellery, and sometimes religious items, while men received weapons, tools, and trading equipment. However, many graves contain mixed assemblages, with women sometimes buried with weapons or trading scales, and men with domestic items, suggesting gender roles more flexible than rigid stereotypes would indicate. Jewellery served as both personal adornment and portable wealth for Viking women. Characteristic female ornaments included oval brooches worn at the shoulders to fasten apron dresses, distinctive trefoil brooches, and strands of glass and amber beads. These items weren't merely decorative, but displayed social status, cultural affiliations, and sometimes religious beliefs through their materials and designs. The settlement pattern of the Viking diaspora significantly affected women's experiences. In initial raiding phases, Viking parties were predominantly male, but as temporary camps evolved into permanent settlements, women joined in increasing numbers. Genetic studies of modern populations in previously Viking-controlled territories show significant female Scandinavian ancestry, confirming substantial women's participation in the colonisation process. In previously uninhabited lands like Iceland, women comprised a smaller percentage of initial settlers, but were essential for establishing viable communities. The Landnámabók mentions numerous female settlers who claimed land independently, particularly widows with resources to finance their own migrations. In the British Isles and Normandy, intermarriage between Viking men and local women created blended families that facilitated cultural integration while maintaining connections to Scandinavian heritage through maternal traditions. As the Viking Age progressed, women's roles evolved alongside broader social changes. Urbanisation created new economic opportunities through specialised craft production and market activities. Christianisation gradually altered religious practices and marriage customs, generally reducing divorce options, but sometimes enhancing protections for widows. Political centralisation, under stronger kings, slowly eroded the independence of family-based power structures, where women had exercised significant informal influence. By the end of the Viking Age, the legal status of Scandinavian women remained stronger than in much of Europe, but the exceptional independence they had enjoyed was gradually being circumscribed by church doctrine and royal authority. Nevertheless, the legacy of Viking women's relative autonomy would influence Nordic societies for centuries, contributing to the distinctive gender traditions that still characterise Scandinavian cultures today. Behind the dramatic raids and conquests that dominate popular conceptions of the Viking Age lay a sophisticated economic system that connected Northern Europe to global trade networks stretching from the North Atlantic to Central Asia. The development of this commercial infrastructure, with its specialised production centres, urban markets and long-distance exchange routes, represented a transformation as significant as the military exploits that often overshadowed it. The emergence of the first true towns in Scandinavia marked a fundamental shift from earlier settlement patterns, dominated by scattered farmsteads and seasonal gathering places. These urban centres, including Hedeby, Hedeby in northern Germany, Birka in Sweden, Kaupang in Norway, and later Ribe and Aarhus in Denmark, created permanent marketplaces where goods, people and ideas converged. Hedeby, situated at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, where the Schlei Fjord meets the Baltic, exemplifies these early trading centres. Archaeological excavations reveal a settlement covering over 24 hectares, protected by a massive semicircular rampart. Within this defensive perimeter, densely packed wooden houses line streets leading down to harbour facilities, where ships from across northern Europe dock to exchange goods. The material record from Hedeby demonstrates its cosmopolitan character. Pottery from the Rhineland, glass from the Middle East, amber from the Baltic, walrus ivory from the North Atlantic, and silks from Byzantium and beyond all pass through this commercial hub. Workshops producing textiles, metalwork, combs, glass beads and other crafts clustered near the waterfront, creating specialised production zones that archaeological investigation has meticulously mapped. Similar patterns appear at Birka on Lake Mälaren in Sweden, though with greater emphasis on eastward trade connections. Here, excavations have uncovered evidence of specialised craftspeople working in close proximity: blacksmiths, jewellers, antler workers and glassmakers, each with distinctive tools and waste products marking their workshops. The cemetery at Birka, with over 3,000 graves, contains an extraordinary range of imported goods reflecting the settlement's position within trade networks, reaching to the Islamic world and beyond. These early urban centres differed from later medieval towns in their heavy dependence on long-distance trade rather than serving primarily regional, agricultural hinterlands. Their populations included not just local Scandinavians, but foreign merchants maintaining seasonal or permanent presences. Archaeological and historical evidence confirms communities of Frisian, Slavic, Anglo-Saxon, and occasionally even more distant traders operating within these Norse commercial centres. The physical organisation of Viking trading towns followed practical considerations rather than formal planning. Buildings clustered along shorelines and waterways to facilitate loading and unloading ships. Streets developed organically, though some settlements show evidence of basic layout planning, particularly in later phases, or after fires necessitated rebuilding. Public spaces for markets and assemblies formed natural focal points, while defensive structures, initially simple ditches and palisades, later more substantial ramparts, protected the accumulated wealth. As these settlements grew, they developed increasingly specialised economic functions. Coinage, initially rare in Scandinavia, became more common, though weight-based silver remained the primary medium for larger transactions throughout much of the Viking Age. Standardised weights, often based on Islamic measurement systems, facilitated commerce between merchants from different regions. Legal frameworks evolved to protect trading activities, with special provisions for foreign merchants in many centres. Beyond Scandinavia proper, Vikings established or transformed urban centres across their sphere of influence. York, Jorvik, under Scandinavian rule became one of England's largest cities, with archaeological evidence from the Coppergate excavations revealing a thriving commercial centre where craftspeople produced goods for both local consumption and export. Dublin, founded as a Viking long-fort ship base, developed into Ireland's first true urban centre, with recent excavations at sites like Wood Quay documenting its evolution from military camp to commercial hub. In the east, Novgorod and Kiev grew from trading posts along the river routes to major cities controlling vast territories. While debate continues about the extent of direct Scandinavian influence in their urban development, archaeological evidence confirms significant Norse presence in their formative periods. Excavations at Raurik-Gorodische near Novgorod and at Gnezdovo near Smolensk show characteristic Scandinavian artefacts alongside Slavic materials, documenting the multicultural nature of these emerging centres. The goods flowing through these networks ranged from essential commodities to exotic luxuries. Bulk goods included iron, timber, tar, salt, grain, and dried fish, materials crucial for shipbuilding, preservation, and basic subsistence. More valuable items included furs, honey, wax, amber, walrus ivory, and falcons for hunting. At the highest end of the value spectrum were silver, gold, silks, spices, glass, and wine, luxury goods that served as both status symbols and stores of wealth. Human beings themselves formed part of this commercial exchange. Slavery was integral to Viking economic systems, with captives taken in raids sold in markets from Dublin to Constantinople. The Arabic term sakaliba, originally meaning Slavs, became a general designation for fair-skinned slaves from northern Europe, many acquired through Viking trading networks. While morally repugnant by modern standards, this human trafficking generated substantial profits that funded further Viking activities and settlements. The archaeological evidence for this trade appears in hoards, collections of valuable items buried for safekeeping and never retrieved. These treasure troves, particularly common on Gotland and across the Baltic region, typically contain silver in various forms, Islamic dirhams, Anglo-Saxon pennies, German Otto Adelheid coins, hack silver, cut pieces, ingots, and jewellery. Analysis of these hoards reveals the changing patterns of Viking economic connections, with early finds dominated by Islamic coins gradually giving way to Western European currency as trading patterns shifted. The mechanics of this commerce involved both barter and monetary exchange. For everyday transactions, direct exchange of goods remained common. For larger deals, silver by weight served as the standard medium, with merchants carrying portable scales to measure precise amounts. Coins were valued primarily for their silver content rather than face value, routinely tested by bending or cutting to verify quality. This pragmatic approach to currency facilitated trade across political boundaries and between monetary systems. The economic networks created during the Viking Age didn't merely transfer goods but also technologies, artistic styles and ideas. Crafting techniques spread along trade routes, creating hybrid styles that combined elements from multiple traditions. The distinctive Bora, Jelling, Mammon, and Ringerike artistic styles that characterise Viking Age decoration evolved partly through such cross-cultural fertilisation, incorporating motifs and techniques from Celtic, Frankish, Byzantine, and Islamic sources, while maintaining distinctively Norse characteristics. As the Viking Age progressed, the nature of Scandinavian economic activity gradually shifted. The early period's emphasis on raiding and tribute-taking gave way to more regular trading relationships. This transition wasn't uniform. Raiding continued in some regions while peaceful commerce dominated others, but the general trend moved toward more stable, institutionalized economic interactions. By the late Viking Age, Scandinavian merchants operated within established commercial networks spanning Europe, with trading privileges negotiated through formal agreements rather than enforced by violence. This evolution reflected changing power dynamics both within Scandinavia and across Europe. As Scandinavian kingdoms consolidated, royal authorities increasingly sought to control and tax trade rather than allowing independent operators free rein. Simultaneously, European states strengthened their defences against raids while becoming more interested in commercial relationships with Norse merchants. The economic incentives shifted from quick plunder towards sustainable exchange relationships that could generate wealth over the long term. Behind the gleaming silver hoards and prestigious trade goods that archaeologists uncover lies a darker aspect of Viking economic life: the extensive trade in human beings. Slavery formed a fundamental component of Norse society and commerce, creating wealth that financed expansion while inflicting immeasurable suffering on its victims. The scale of this human trafficking raises a provocative question. Could the Viking Age, as we know it, have existed without the economic foundation provided by slavery? The Norse term for slaves, thralls, appears frequently in both literary sources and legal codes, indicating their ubiquity in Scandinavian society. These unfree individuals occupied the lowest social stratum, possessing few rights and subject to their owner's authority in nearly all matters. They could be bought, sold, given as gifts, or sacrificed at their master's funerals. Their children inherited their unfree status, creating a permanent underclass within Norse communities. Slaves came from three primary sources. Most were captured during raids on foreign territories, with coastal communities in Britain, Ireland, Francia, and the Baltic particularly vulnerable to such predation. The Irish annals record dozens of slave raids, with one in 821 CE noting that an uncountable number of women were carried off from the coast. Second, internal Scandinavian warfare and judicial punishments created a domestic supply, with debt bondage and criminal penalties reducing some Norse people to servitude. Finally, children born to slave mothers automatically became slaves, regardless of their father's status. Archaeological evidence for slavery appears in multiple forms. Neck rings and shackles found at trading centres like Birka and Hedeby confirm the physical restraint of human merchandise. Ship burials occasionally include individuals positioned differently from the main deceased, interpreted as sacrificed slaves accompanying their masters to the afterlife. Most telling are historical accounts like Ibn Fadlan's eyewitness description of a slave girl sacrificed during a chieftain's funeral on the Volga, providing gruesome details of a practice hinted at in the archaeological record. The economic value of slaves varied based on age, gender, skills, and physical condition. Young women commanded the highest prices, particularly in Islamic markets, where they might serve as domestic servants or concubines. Men valued for labour typically fetched lower prices, but found ready markets throughout the Viking world and beyond. Contemporary sources mention specialised slave markets in Dublin, Hedeby, and along the Volga trade route, with standardised pricing suggesting a well-established commercial system. The geographic scope of Viking slave-taking was vast. The western expansion targeted Celtic and Anglo-Saxon populations, with Dublin emerging as a major slave trading hub. Archaeological evidence from Wood Quay in Dublin includes chains and restraints associated with holding pens near the waterfront, where human cargo awaited transport or sale. In the east, Slavic populations along the Baltic and deep into the Russian river systems became frequent targets, with captives funneled through trading centres like Staraya Ladoga and Gnezdovo toward markets in the Islamic world. The fate of these captives varied widely. Some were transported thousands of miles from their homelands, with Irish captives ending up in Iceland or even North Africa, and Slavic slaves reaching markets in Baghdad and beyond. Others remained closer to their places of origin, labouring on Scandinavian-owned farms in the British Isles or Eastern Territories. The most unfortunate might be selected for ritual sacrifice during religious ceremonies or funerals, their deaths considered prestigious offerings to the gods. Daily life for thralls in Scandinavian households meant hard physical labour with few legal protections. They performed the most demanding and dangerous tasks: clearing land, tending livestock, rowing ships, mining, and construction work. Female slaves endured domestic drudgery, textile production, and often sexual exploitation. While some literary sources suggest the possibility of manumission, freedom, after loyal service or through self-purchase, such opportunities remained exceptional rather than routine. The economic importance of slavery to Viking expansion cannot be overstated. Slave-taking generated immediate profits through ransom or sale, while the labour of retained thralls produced agricultural surpluses that supported non-farming specialists like warriors, shipbuilders, and craftspeople. The wealth accumulated through human trafficking financed shipbuilding, weapons production, and further raids in a self-reinforcing cycle of expansion and exploitation. This reliance on slavery helps explain certain patterns of Viking activity. Areas repeatedly targeted for raids, like the monasteries of Ireland or the Slavic settlements of the Baltic, represented not just sources of portable wealth, but human resources that could be monetised in distant markets. The establishment of permanent bases in places like Dublin served not only military purposes, but facilitated the collection, temporary housing, and transshipment of captives. The gradual Christianisation of Scandinavia eventually moderated but did not eliminate slavery. While the Church discouraged enslaving fellow Christians, it accommodated existing slave ownership and permitted the enslavement of non-Christians. Only in the late Viking Age did legal codes begin placing modest restrictions on the treatment of slaves, reflecting both Christian influence and the declining economic centrality of slavery as alternative commercial opportunities expanded. By the 11th century, changing economic patterns were reducing Viking dependence on slave-taking. The development of more regular trade relationships, urbanisation, specialised craft production, and agricultural intensification created alternative sources of wealth. Simultaneously, improved defences in frequently raided regions made capturing slaves more difficult and dangerous. These factors, combined with gradual Christian ethical influence, began the long process of slavery's decline in Scandinavia, though the institution would persist in modified forms well beyond the Viking Age. The legacy of this slave economy extended far beyond Scandinavia itself. Genetic studies of modern Icelandic populations reveal significant Celtic female ancestry, likely reflecting the forced migration of Irish and Scottish women as slaves during the settlement period. Similar genetic signatures appear across the Viking diaspora, testament to the thousands of individuals transported against their will who nevertheless became ancestors to subsequent generations. Their untold stories of trauma, survival, resistance and eventually integration remain largely hidden behind the more celebrated narratives of Viking achievement. The most profound transformation of the Viking Age wasn't territorial conquest or economic development, but a fundamental shift in worldview, the conversion of Scandinavia from its traditional polytheistic religion to Christianity. This process, spanning more than 2 centuries, wasn't simply the replacement of one set of beliefs with another, but a complex renegotiation of cultural identity, political relationships and social structures that would permanently alter Norse civilization. The first documented Christian mission to Scandinavia came in 823 CE, when the Frankish monk Ansgar travelled to Denmark at the invitation of the Danish king Harald Klak, who had been baptised at the court of Louis the Pious. This initial effort produced limited results. Harald was soon driven from power, and Ansgar's small church at Hedeby attracted few converts. Nevertheless, it established a pattern of missionary activity targeting Scandinavian elites that would eventually prove successful. Subsequent missions followed a similar approach, focusing on converting rulers in the hope that their subjects would follow. This strategy recognised the practical reality that in Norse society, religion was deeply intertwined with political loyalty and social cohesion. When a king converted, his decision carried weight beyond personal belief. It realigned political relationships, both internally and with Christian Europe. The first major breakthrough came with Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who declared his conversion around 965 CE on the larger of the 2 Jelling stones. Harald, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. Archaeological evidence confirms this wasn't mere boasting. Harald built Denmark's first official churches and reorganised royal burial practices along Christian lines, abandoning the ship burials and grave goods of his ancestors. What motivated Harald's conversion? Political calculation certainly played a role. By accepting Christianity, he neutralised the threat of religious warfare from the powerful German Empire to his south, while gaining recognition as a legitimate ruler from other Christian monarchs. The new religion also offered administrative advantages through literate clergy who could assist in governance. Yet dismissing his conversion as purely pragmatic oversimplifies the complex spiritual and cultural negotiations occurring throughout Scandinavia. In Norway, the conversion process followed a more contentious path. Olaf Tryggvason ruled 995 to 1000 CE, and later Olaf Haraldsson ruled 1015 to 1028 CE, pursued aggressive Christianization policies, destroying pagan temples, punishing those who clung to old practices, and forcing baptism at sword point in some regions. The sagas describe Olaf Tryggvason giving chieftains stark choices: accept baptism or face torture and execution. This forceful approach generated significant resistance. When Olaf Haraldsson, later canonised as Saint Olaf, was killed at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 while attempting to reclaim his throne, he was fighting against Norwegian nobles who opposed both his centralisation of power and his religious policies. Ironically, his death and subsequent veneration as a martyr did more to advance Christianity in Norway than his violent methods had achieved in life. Sweden's conversion came later and more gradually. While some Swedish rulers accepted baptism as early as the 9th century, widespread Christianization didn't occur until the 11th century under kings like Olaf Skotkonung and Inge I. The famous account by Adam of Bremen of the destruction of the great pagan temple at Uppsala by King Inge around 1080 marks a symbolic turning point, though traditional practices persisted in remote areas for generations. Iceland's conversion presents a particularly fascinating case. Facing growing tensions between pagan and Christian factions that threatened civil war, Icelanders took a uniquely pragmatic approach. At the Althing National Assembly in 1000 CE, they delegated the decision to the law speaker, Thorgeir Thorkelson, who, after a day and night of contemplation, declared that Iceland would officially become Christian, while allowing limited private continuation of pagan practices. This compromise preserved social unity, while beginning the gradual process of religious transformation. The archaeological record provides compelling evidence for this transition period. Burial practices show particularly clear changes, with grave goods gradually disappearing and body orientation shifting to the Christian east-west alignment. Pendant crosses appear alongside Thor's hammer amulets in 10th century graves, suggesting individuals hedging their spiritual bets during this time of religious uncertainty. Church construction began slowly but accelerated dramatically in the 11th century, creating new focal points for communities previously centred around pagan sacred sites. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this conversion period is the syncretism, the blending of religious elements that characterised the transitional decades. Far from an immediate and complete replacement of old beliefs, the process involved creative adaptation and reinterpretation of traditional practices within a Christian framework. Runic inscriptions demonstrate this blending vividly. The Jelling stone combines a Christian cross with traditional dragon ornamentation. Other stones from this period invoke both Christ and Thor in the same inscription, or ask Christ to help the deceased to Valhalla, concepts that would seem contradictory to theological purists, but reflected the lived reality of spiritual transition. Material culture shows similar hybridization. Artisans created crosses, decorated with traditional Norse motifs like intertwined animals and dragons. Church doorways incorporated carvings reminiscent of earlier pagan designs. Even church locations often deliberately overlapped with previous sacred sites, building upon their established spiritual significance, while redirecting it toward Christian worship. This syncretism wasn't merely aesthetic, but extended to religious concepts and practices. Elements of traditional Norse religion found new expressions within Christian contexts. The cult of saints, particularly warrior saints like St. Olaf and St. Michael, provided continuity with earlier veneration of heroic figures. Seasonal celebrations were maintained with Christian reinterpretation, Yule becoming Christmas, spring fertility rituals transformed into Easter observances. The conversion process affected different social groups in different ways. Elite men, with their direct political connections to European powers, often led the transition. Women who had held significant religious roles in traditional Norse practice as völur, seers, and ritual specialists generally experienced a reduction in formal religious authority under Christianity, though they remained important as early converts who influenced family religious practice. Rural populations typically maintained traditional practices longer than urban dwellers, with remote areas of Sweden and Norway documenting pagan rituals well into the 12th century. Archaeological evidence from farm sites shows continued use of Thor's hammer amulets and other pagan symbols decades after official conversion, suggesting private continuation of old beliefs alongside public Christian observance. The Christianization of Scandinavia had profound implications beyond religious practice itself. The introduction of Latin literacy through the church created new possibilities for record-keeping, administration, and literary production. While runic writing continued, Latin script gradually became dominant for official and commercial purposes, connecting Scandinavia more firmly to European textual traditions. Church organisation introduced hierarchical structures that reinforced emerging state power. Bishops and priests, often initially foreigners but increasingly native Scandinavians, created networks of authority parallel to and supportive of royal administration. Monasteries established centres of learning, agricultural innovation, and economic development. Church taxes created new revenue streams that funded both religious and secular projects. Perhaps most significantly, Christianity altered Scandinavia's relationship with the rest of Europe. No longer perceived as dangerous pagan outsiders, Scandinavian kingdoms joined the community of Christian states, participating in international church councils, dynastic marriages, with other Christian ruling houses and shared cultural developments. This integration reduced conflict while opening new opportunities for trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The conversion process also transformed Norse self-understanding and historical consciousness. As Christian literacy took hold, Scandinavians began recording their own past in new ways. The Icelandic sagas, written primarily in the 12th and 13th centuries by Christian authors, preserved pre-Christian stories and traditions, but framed them within a Christian historical understanding that viewed paganism as a preliminary stage in divine providence. By the end of the Viking Age, around 1100 CE, Christianity had become firmly established across Scandinavia, though regional variations in practice and lingering traditional elements remained. The old gods hadn't been entirely forgotten. They survived in place names, folklore, literature, and occasional private devotion, but their public worship had largely disappeared. The Norse worldview had fundamentally shifted from a polytheistic understanding centered on maintaining cosmic order against chaos to a monotheistic framework, oriented towards salvation history and divine judgment. This religious transformation, more than any political or military development, marked the true end of the Viking Age. The warrior ethos that had celebrated raiding as a legitimate path to wealth and fame gave way to Christian concepts of just war and legitimate authority. The gift-giving economy that had fueled chieftains' need for portable wealth was gradually replaced by more institutionalized forms of taxation and land-based revenue. The Norse identity that had defined itself partly in opposition to Christian Europe was reconstituted within a Christian framework, maintaining distinctive cultural elements while abandoning its most aggressive expressions. Scattered across the Scandinavian landscape stand thousands of stones bearing enigmatic inscriptions and intricate carvings, silent witnesses to the Viking Age transition from a primarily oral culture to one increasingly engaged with written expression. These runestones represent one of the most distinctive Norse cultural contributions, providing direct contemporary evidence of how Vikings viewed themselves and wished to be remembered. The runic alphabet, or futhark, named for its first 6 letters, predates the Viking Age considerably, with the earliest inscriptions dating to around 150 CE. This older script, known as the Elder Futhark, contained 24 characters and was used across Germanic Europe. Around 700 CE, as the Viking Age approached, this system evolved into the more streamlined younger Futhark, with just 16 runes specifically adapted to the Old Norse language. This simplified alphabet would become the standard writing system throughout the Viking world. What makes runic writing distinctive is its angular character. Straight lines predominate, with few curves or horizontal strokes. This design wasn't arbitrary but practical, suited for carving into wood, bone and stone using a knife or chisel. Unlike the curved Latin alphabet designed for ink on parchment, runes were created for permanent inscription on durable materials in a northern environment where parchment was scarce and expensive. Early runic inscriptions tend to be brief, owner's marks, simple memorial statements, or magical formulas. As the Viking Age progressed, inscriptions became increasingly elaborate, with the 11th century representing the golden age of runestone carving. Sweden alone contains over 2,500 runestones, with particular concentrations in upland and around Lake Mälaren. Denmark has approximately 250, while Norway has around 50 surviving examples. Could a recently translated inscription from Södermanland, Sweden, change our understanding of Viking social organisation? This remarkable stone, deciphered in 2016, appears to reference a previously unknown female military leader who commanded a garrison, challenging traditional assumptions about gender roles in Norse military structures. The content of these inscriptions reveals much about Viking Age concerns and values. The vast majority are memorials raised by family members to honour deceased relatives, typically following a formula. Person A raised this stone in memory of Person B. His/her relationship. Many add information about the deceased's status, achievements, or manner of death. particularly noting those who died abroad on Viking expeditions. The Kula runestone exemplifies this commemorative tradition. Alric raised the stone in memory of Sigvid, his father. He fell in Holmgard, Novgorod, the ship's leader, with his seamen. Such inscriptions map the vast reach of Viking activity, mentioning deaths in England, Ireland, Greece, the Byzantine Empire, Sirkland, the Islamic territories, and along the eastern route, Austervega. Beyond simple memorials, runestones served multiple social purposes. They demonstrated family wealth and status through their size and artistic elaboration. They established inheritance claims by publicly declaring family relationships. They marked territory and travel routes, often standing at property boundaries or alongside roads and bridges. Some even combined practical infrastructure with commemoration, recording that individuals had built bridges for public benefit and for their own soul's salvation. This last category, the bridge stones, reflects the influence of Christianity on runic tradition. As conversions spread across Scandinavia, runestones increasingly incorporated Christian elements. Crosses became common decorative features, and inscriptions began including prayers for the deceased soul. The Järvsta stone from Gästrikland, Sweden, shows this Christian influence clearly. Anund and Torni and Tordis made this bridge in memory of Torkel, their father. May God help his spirit and soul. The artistic aspects of runestones developed alongside their textual content. Early examples feature simple inscriptions, but by the 11th century, complex designs had evolved. Text typically runs in bands following the stone's contours, often within the body of a serpent or dragon. Interlaced animal figures, Christian crosses, and scenes from mythology or contemporary life might accompany the inscription. Regional styles emerged, with distinct traditions in different parts of Scandinavia. The most elaborate example is undoubtedly the Ruk stone from Östergötland, Sweden. This massive monument contains over 760 characters, the longest known runic inscription, combining straightforward memorial text with cryptic references to mythology, heroic legends, and possibly historical events. Its complex self-referential wordplay and deliberate obscurity suggest an audience familiar with sophisticated literary techniques, challenging simplistic views of Viking Age intellectual culture. Who created these monuments? Some stones bear signatures, identifying their carvers. Erpir carved the runes, or Osmund made this monument. These signatures appear repeatedly across regions, indicating professional rune masters who specialised in this craft. These artisans weren't merely technical specialists, but masters of language, poetry, and visual design who could translate a family's commemorative wishes into a permanent public statement. The question of literacy in Viking society remains complex. Runic writing was certainly more widespread than Latin literacy, which remained primarily limited to ecclesiastical contexts until late in the period. Evidence suggests basic runic literacy, the ability to read and write simple messages, was relatively common among free men and some women, particularly in trading contexts where practical literacy offered advantages. Archaeological finds of everyday runic usage support this view. Excavations at trading centres like Hedeby and Bergen have uncovered hundreds of wooden sticks and other objects bearing mundane inscriptions, ownership marks, simple messages, business records, and occasionally even love notes or obscene graffiti. These casual uses suggest runic writing wasn't restricted to formal monuments, but served practical communication needs. However, more complex literary composition likely remained a specialised skill. The sophisticated wordplay and poetic techniques evident in some runestone inscriptions implied trained specialists with advanced linguistic knowledge. The transition from primarily oral to written culture was gradual, with runic writing initially supplementing rather than replacing oral tradition. This oral foundation remained strong throughout the Viking Age. The complex poetic forms of skaldic verse, with their strict metrical requirements, elaborate kennings, metaphorical circumlocutions, and intricate alliteration patterns, were designed for memorization and oral performance. Even as runic writing developed, this oral poetic tradition continued as the primary vehicle for preserving historical memory, genealogical knowledge, and cultural values. The relationship between runic and Latin writing evolved as Christianity spread. Initially separate traditions, they gradually converged, with some late Viking Age inscriptions showing Latin influence in letter forms or even mixing alphabets. By the 12th century, Latin script had largely supplanted runes for administrative and literary purposes, though runic writing persisted for everyday use in some regions well into the medieval period, particularly in rural Sweden, and in specialised contexts like merchants' marks. Among the most historically significant runestones are those that document the formation of the Scandinavian kingdoms. The Jelling monuments in Denmark, commissioned by King Gorm and his son Harald Bluetooth in the 10th century, explicitly claim royal authority over all Denmark and record the official conversion to Christianity. In Sweden, the Asperlert stones reference the election of kings, providing rare contemporary evidence for royal succession practices. Other famous inscriptions include the Karlevi stone on Öland, which contains a complete verse in complex skaldic metre commemorating a Danish military leader, the Frøsø stone, which directly references the conversion process by noting it stands where sacrifices were previously held, and the Kensington runestone from Minnesota, a controversial 19th century find most scholars consider a modern hoax, but which continues to generate debate about possible late Norse presence in North America. The Greece runestones form a particularly fascinating group. Found primarily in upland Sweden, these monuments commemorate men who died in Griqualand, the Byzantine Empire, or served in the Varangian Guard. The Piraeus lion, a marble statue in Venice that was originally in Athens, bears runic inscriptions carved by Varangian guardsmen in the 11th century, physical evidence of Norse presence in the Mediterranean that confirms the runestone commemorations. As historical sources, runestones offer unique advantages and limitations. Unlike retrospective texts written centuries later, they provide contemporary evidence from the Viking Age itself. However, their commemorative nature means they present idealised versions of events, emphasising glory while minimising failures. They tell us how Viking Age Scandinavians wanted to be remembered rather than providing objective historical records. Nevertheless, these carved monuments offer invaluable insights into Viking Age mentalities, values, and self-perception. They demonstrate pride in far-flung travels and achievements, strong family connections, the gradual integration of Christian concepts with traditional practices, and the emergence of more centralised political authority. As both text and monument, they embody the transition from a purely oral culture to one increasingly engaged with written expression, bridging the pre-literate past and the textual future that would preserve the Norse legacy for centuries to come. As the 10th century gave way to the 11th, the nature of Viking power underwent a profound transformation. The era of independent raiders and entrepreneurial chieftains was giving way to something more organised and ambitious, the age of Viking kings who sought not merely to plunder foreign lands but to rule them. This period would see Scandinavian rulers briefly establish dominance across much of northern Europe, creating short-lived empires that represented the apex of Viking political achievement. The most dramatic manifestation of this new royal ambition began in 1013 when Svein Forkbeard, King of Denmark, launched a full-scale invasion of England. Unlike earlier Viking forces that sought primarily wealth through raiding or tribute, Svein aimed for outright conquest and direct rule. His campaign proved remarkably successful. By the end of 1013, most English regions had submitted to him, and King Ethelred II, known as the Unready, had fled to Normandy. Svein's triumph proved short-lived. He died suddenly in February 1014, having ruled England for just 5 weeks. The English quickly recalled Ethelred, but Svein's son Cnut, often anglicised as Cnut, was determined to reclaim what he considered his inheritance. After initial setbacks and the death of Ethelred in 1016, Cnut defeated the English king's son, Edmund Ironside, at the Battle of Ascendon. A subsequent agreement divided the kingdom, but when Edmund died shortly afterward, Cnut became sole ruler of England. What followed was extraordinary. Rather than treating England as a conquered territory to be exploited, Cnut established himself as a legitimate English king. He married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, dismissed most of his Viking army, and largely maintained existing English administrative structures. He issued laws reinforcing traditional English practices while adding provisions against lingering Viking raiding. He patronised the English church, making lavish donations and going on pilgrimage to Rome in 1027. This conciliatory approach reflected political pragmatism rather than weakness. Cnut recognised that ruling England required working within its established systems rather than imposing foreign practices. At the same time, he was careful to reward his Scandinavian supporters, placing trusted Danish jarls in key positions while balancing their influence with native English nobles. Cnut's ambitions extended far beyond England. Already King of Denmark, having succeeded his brother Harold, he established control over Norway in 1028, deposing Olaf Haraldsson, later saint. Olaf. He also claimed overlordship of parts of Sweden, Scotland and Wales. At its height, his North Sea Empire encompassed most of Scandinavia and the British Isles, the largest realm ever governed by a Viking ruler. The paradox of Cnut's reign is that this quintessential Viking conqueror became one of England's most effective early medieval kings. Contemporary chronicles, after initial hostility, came to praise his governance. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes that he sent over all England into every shire his men, establishing effective royal control throughout the kingdom. He maintained peace, promoted trade, and strengthened England's international standing through diplomatic connections with continental powers. The famous anecdote of Sir Cnut commanding the tide to halt, often misinterpreted as showing royal arrogance, actually demonstrates the opposite. According to the earliest account by Henry of Huntingdon, Sir Cnut arranged this demonstration precisely to show his courtiers the limitations of royal power, proving that even the most powerful king remained subject to natural and divine laws. This sophisticated understanding of kingship's boundaries reflects Cnut's political maturity. Archaeological evidence from Cnut's reign shows increased urban prosperity and international connections. Excavations at sites like York and London reveal growing commercial activity, with imported goods from across Cnut's territories and beyond. Coinage reforms standardised currency throughout his realms, facilitating trade within this northern commercial zone. The distinctive, pointed helmet-type pennies minted across his territories visually reinforced the unity of his disparate possessions. Cnut's empire, impressive as it was, contained the seeds of its own dissolution. Ruling territories separated by the North Sea created inherent administrative challenges. Each component realm had distinct traditions, expectations, and power structures requiring different approaches. Maintaining control demanded constant travel between his domains or delegation to regents who might develop independent ambitions. Following Cnut's death in 1035, his achievement rapidly unravelled. His empire was divided among his sons. Harold Harefoot took England, Harthacnut received Denmark, and Svein got Norway. Succession disputes combined with Norwegian resistance under Magnus the Good, son of Saint Olaf, quickly eroded Scandinavian control. By 1042, following the deaths of Cnut's sons without heirs, the English throne returned to the native Anglo-Saxon line with Edward the Confessor, while separate kings ruled in Denmark and Norway. While Cnut's empire proved ephemeral, it demonstrated the potential for Scandinavian leadership beyond raiding and settlement. It represented a maturing of Viking political ambition from exploitation to governance, establishing precedents for later medieval state building. The commercial, cultural, and dynastic connections established during this period would influence northern European development long after direct political unity had dissolved. As Cnut's empire disintegrated, Scandinavian royal power consolidated within traditional boundaries. In Norway, Magnus the Good, ruled 1035 to 1047, restored independence from Danish control and briefly established Norwegian rule over Denmark itself. His successor and uncle, Harald Sigurdsson, better known as Harald Hardrada, Hard Ruler, would become the last great Viking adventurer king and a pivotal figure in the Viking Age's conclusion. Harald's early career epitomised the traditional Viking path to power through foreign adventure. After fleeing Norway following his half-brother's defeat at Stiklestad in 1030, the teenage Harald made his way to Kievan Russes and then to Constantinople, where he served in the Varangian Guard. Byzantine sources confirm his distinguished military service across the empire's territories, from Sicily to the Holy Land. During his 15 years abroad, Harald accumulated enormous wealth through military service, trading ventures, and possibly plunder. The sagas claim he sent regular shipments of treasure to Prince Yaroslav of Kiev for safekeeping, amassing resources that would later fund his bid for power in Norway. When he finally returned north around 1045, he leveraged this wealth to press his claim to the Norwegian throne, eventually becoming sole ruler following Magnus's death in 1047. As king, Harald combined traditional Viking aggression with sophisticated statecraft. Domestically, he strengthened royal authority by establishing new market towns, reforming coinage, and asserting greater control over the church. He built royal estates across Norway and installed loyal supporters in key positions, creating a more centralised governance structure than his predecessors had achieved. In foreign policy, Harald pursued both diplomatic and military approaches. He secured his southern border through a peace agreement with Svein Estridsson of Denmark, married his son to a Danish princess, and established relations with various European powers. At the same time, he conducted aggressive campaigns to enforce Norwegian interests, particularly against Denmark when opportunities arose. Harald's rule demonstrated the tension between traditional Viking values and the demands of medieval kingship. Raised in the old warrior ethos that celebrated personal combat prowess and the pursuit of wealth through adventure, he simultaneously worked to build state institutions that would outlast individual rulers. His nickname Hardrada reflected both his personal toughness and his demanding approach to governance, extracting higher taxes, enforcing stricter laws, and brooking little opposition to royal authority. The sagas portray Harald as the last great king in the old Viking mould, physically imposing, personally brave, cunning, sometimes cruel, but also generous to followers and possessing a sense of humour. The historical Harald was certainly a transitional figure, with one foot in the Viking past of personal warbands and heroic leadership, and the other in the medieval future of institutional authority and territorial sovereignty. This transitional quality makes Harald's final campaign particularly significant. In September 1066, he launched an invasion of England, claiming the throne based on an alleged agreement with the previous king Magnus. Landing in northern England with a substantial force, perhaps 10,000 men in 300 ships according to contemporary estimates, he initially achieved success, defeating local forces and capturing York. The timing of Harald's invasion proved fatally unfortunate. Just as he secured his position in northern England, the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson force-marched his army north from southern England, where he had been preparing to meet a separate invasion threat from William of Normandy. On September 25, 1066, the two armies met at Stamford Bridge outside York. The battle proved decisive. Despite their fearsome reputation, Harold's forces were caught by surprise, possibly separated from their ships and not fully prepared for battle. The fighting was intense. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports that one berserker Viking temporarily held the narrow bridge single-handedly, but ended with a complete English victory. Harald Hardrada fell in the battle, shot through the throat by an arrow, according to some accounts. With him died not just a king, but symbolically the Viking Age itself. Just 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson himself would fall at the Battle of Hastings against William of Normandy, creating one of history's great ironies. The Norman conquerors who ended Anglo-Saxon England were themselves descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France in the early 10th century. Viking influence would continue through this Norman dynasty, though transformed and integrated into medieval European feudal structures. The age of Viking kings had demonstrated both the potential and limitations of Scandinavian royal power. Rulers like Cnut had briefly achieved remarkable international dominance, while figures like Harald Hardrada represented the culmination of traditional Viking leadership values. Yet these achievements proved difficult to sustain across generations. The very mobility and personal nature of Viking power that enabled rapid expansion also created challenges for institutional continuity. Internal conflicts further undermined Scandinavian royal stability during this period. In Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, succession disputes were common, with multiple claimants often fighting for the throne simultaneously. These conflicts reflected the transitional nature of Scandinavian kingship, evolving from elective leadership based on personal qualities toward hereditary monarchy, but without firmly established succession rules. The sagas record numerous such power struggles, with kings and pretenders rising and falling in rapid succession. Norway was particularly prone to such conflicts, with periods when multiple rulers claimed different regions simultaneously. These internal divisions weakened Scandinavian kingdoms at precisely the time when European states were growing more organised and powerful, contributing to the Viking Age's conclusion. Despite these limitations, the legacy of Viking kingship would prove enduring. The state structures established during this period, administrative districts, tax systems, royal estates, and legal frameworks, created foundations for the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms that would eventually evolve into modern Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. The balance between royal authority and traditional rights of free farmers, particularly as expressed through regional assemblies, would influence Scandinavian political development for centuries. The year 1066 stands as one of history's great turning points, a moment when three powerful men and their armies fought for control of England in a series of battles that would permanently alter the course of European history. These events not only determined England's political future, but also marked the symbolic end of the Viking Age, closing a chapter that had begun nearly 3 centuries earlier on the shores of Lindisfarne. The drama began with the death of Edward the Confessor, England's childless king, in January 1066. 3 main claimants emerged: Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, who had dominated English politics in Edward's later years; William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed Edward had promised him the succession; and Harald Hardrada of Norway, who based his claim on an alleged agreement between previous Norwegian and English kings. Harold Godwinson moved quickest, having himself crowned on January 6th, the day after Edward's death. This prompt action secured his immediate position, but antagonised the other claimants. William began assembling an invasion force in Normandy, while Harald Hardrada prepared his fleet in Norway. England faced the threat of simultaneous invasions from both north and south, a nightmare scenario that would stretch its defences to the breaking point. Harald Hardrada struck first. In early September 1066, a Norwegian fleet of around 300 ships carrying perhaps 9,000 warriors landed in northern England. Harold was joined by Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own exiled brother, who brought additional forces and valuable knowledge of English politics and terrain. After raiding the Yorkshire coast, they sailed up the Humber estuary and the River Ouse toward York. On September 20th, this combined force defeated the northern English earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford Gate. York surrendered, and Harold established his position at Stamford Bridge, about 7 miles east of the city. The Norwegians, believing they had overcome the main resistance, relaxed their guard. Many left their armour with their ships, not expecting further immediate conflict. Meanwhile, Harold Godwinson had been maintaining forces in southern England, anticipating William's invasion from Normandy. When news reached him of the Norwegian landing, he faced a critical decision: remain in the south to meet William, or march north to confront Harold. Choosing the immediate threat, Harold led his housecarls, professional warriors, and as many feared militia troops as could keep pace on a remarkable forced march covering nearly 190 miles in just 4 days. The speed of Harold's response achieved complete surprise. On September 25th, his army appeared before the unprepared Norwegians at Stamford Bridge. According to the sagas, Harold Hardrada was stunned when he saw the approaching English forces, asking Tostig whose army it was. When told it was Harold Godwinson, he remarked that this Harold has shown great daring. I thought it more likely he would be defending his land in the south. The battle began with the famous episode of the Berserker at the bridge. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports that a single massive Norwegian warrior held the narrow bridge across the river Derwent, temporarily blocking the entire English army until he was killed by a spear thrust from below through a gap in the planking. This delay allowed some of the Norwegians to form a shield wall, but many were caught without their armour. The fighting was exceptionally fierce. Harold Hardrada, conspicuous in his blue tunic and wielding his famous two-handed axe, Land Waster, fought in the thick of the battle until struck in the throat by an arrow. Tostig took command but was also killed. By day's end, the Norwegian force was shattered. So many died that, according to tradition, only 24 ships were needed to carry the survivors home, compared to the 300 that had arrived. Stamford Bridge ranks among the most decisive battles in English history. It effectively ended Norwegian ambitions in England and marked the last major Viking invasion of Western Europe. Had Harold Hardrada won, the subsequent course of English and European history might have been dramatically different, potentially creating a North Sea empire reminiscent of Cnut's earlier achievement. Harold Godwinson had little time to savour his victory. Just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed on the south coast with an invasion force of around 7,000 men. Harold was forced to march his weary army south immediately, covering another 190 miles to confront this new threat. The connection between these Norman invaders and the Vikings represents one of history's great ironies. William and his followers were descendants of Scandinavian settlers who had established themselves in northern France in the early 10th century. The very name Normandy derives from Northmen, acknowledging the region's Norse founders. Rollo Hrolf, the first Duke of Normandy and William's great-great-grandfather, was a Viking leader who received the territory from the French King Charles the Simple in 911 as part of a peace agreement. By 1066, these Norman descendants of Vikings had thoroughly adopted French language, feudal customs, and Catholic religious practices. They had transformed from raiders to feudal lords, developing a distinctive military culture centred on heavy cavalry and castle building rather than longships and raiding. Yet they retained the Norse aggressive expansionism and appetite for conquest, now channeled through medieval Christian frameworks of legitimate warfare. Harold reached London on October 6th, gathering additional forces before proceeding to confront William, who was ravaging the countryside around Hastings to provoke a response. Despite advice to wait for additional troops, Harold decided to force battle immediately. On October 14th, the English took position on Senlac Hill near Hastings, forming their traditional shield wall. The Battle of Hastings lasted nearly a full day, unusually long for medieval engagements. The English shield wall initially held firm against Norman cavalry charges and archer fire. As the day progressed, however, a series of events turned the tide. The Normans executed feigned retreats that tempted portions of the English line to break formation in pursuit, allowing the Norman cavalry to isolate and destroy these groups. By late afternoon, Harold himself was killed, traditionally said to be shot through the eye with an arrow, though contemporary accounts differ. With their king dead and their formation broken, the remaining English forces fled. William had won, earning his epithet, the Conqueror, and initiating the Norman conquest of England. This victory would transform English society, introducing Norman French aristocracy, language influences, feudal structures, and architectural styles that would permanently alter English culture. The twin battles of 1066, Stamford Bridge and Hastings, thus created a historical bookend to the Viking Age. At Stamford Bridge, the last great Viking king fell in battle, ending Scandinavian military ambitions in Western Europe. At Hastings, descendants of Vikings who had transformed themselves into feudal Christians defeated the Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had developed in response to earlier Viking invasions. The circle was complete. Vikings had both initiated and concluded a transformative period in European history. The timing of these events coincided with broader changes across Scandinavia itself. Christianity had largely replaced traditional Norse religion, altering cultural values and international relationships. Trade was supplanting raiding as the primary mode of international interaction. Royal authority was consolidating into more stable medieval kingdoms. The distinctive Viking Age, characterised by longship raids, expansion through independent initiative, and pagan cultural foundations, was giving way to a new medieval Scandinavian identity integrated into Christian European structures. The Viking Age didn't end with a sudden collapse, but rather through a gradual transformation that altered the fundamental nature of Scandinavian engagement with the wider world. This transition resulted from multiple interconnected factors, both internal to Scandinavian society and external in the changing European environment. Perhaps the most significant external change was the strengthening of European kingdoms and their improved defensive capabilities. The initial Viking success had depended partly on exploiting the fragmentation and unpreparedness of post-Carolingian Europe. By the late 10th and 11th centuries, this situation had changed dramatically. In England, Wessex kings had developed the boer system, fortified towns that provided defensive strongpoints against raiders. In Francia, local counts and dukes had established castles and trained mounted forces capable of responding quickly to coastal attacks. These defensive improvements made traditional raiding increasingly costly and dangerous. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records numerous instances where Viking forces suffered heavy casualties when confronting organised resistance. As potential targets became better defended, the risk-reward calculation that had made raiding attractive shifted significantly. Scandinavian leaders increasingly sought alternative strategies for acquiring wealth and status. Economic shifts further accelerated this transition. The development of regular trade networks and urban centres within Scandinavia created new opportunities for wealth acquisition without the dangers of raiding. Archaeological evidence from trading centres like Hedeby, Birka, and Kaupang shows increasing sophistication in craft production, commercial organisation, and international exchange during the 10th and 11th centuries. The silver crisis of the late 10th century, when the flow of Islamic silver into Scandinavia via the Russian rivers decreased dramatically due to political instability in the Middle East, forced further economic adaptation. With this important source of portable wealth diminished, Scandinavians increasingly turned to agricultural intensification, resource extraction, and manufactured exports to maintain their economies. Political consolidation within Scandinavia itself redirected energies that had previously fueled foreign adventures. As kings like Harald Bluetooth in Denmark, Olaf Tryggvason in Norway, and Olaf Köttkonung in Sweden established stronger central authority, they sought to channel Viking activity towards state building rather than independent raiding. Royal power increasingly depended on taxation and administrative control rather than the personal wealth acquired through foreign plunder. These emerging Scandinavian states had different priorities than individual raiders or chieftains. Kings sought diplomatic recognition, stable trade relationships, and dynastic connections with other European powers rather than short-term gains from raiding. Royal authority increasingly suppressed unauthorised raiding that might disrupt these valuable international relationships. Christianization profoundly influenced this transformation. The new religion brought not just different beliefs, but altered ethical frameworks that gradually delegitimized raiding against fellow Christians. While early converted kings might still attack non-Christian territories, the expansion of Christianity across Europe progressively limited acceptable targets. Church authorities increasingly condemned attacks on Christian communities, placing spiritual pressure on Scandinavian rulers to control their subjects' activities. Beyond these practical considerations, Christianity introduced new concepts of kingship, law and social organisation that transformed Scandinavian self-understanding. The ideal Christian king was a protector of his people and the church, not primarily a war leader seeking personal glory. This shift in royal ideology gradually altered the relationship between rulers and warriors, creating more institutionalised military structures under royal control. The cultural assimilation of Viking settlers abroad further contributed to the age's conclusion. In regions like Normandy, the Danelaw in England, and parts of Ireland, descendants of Norse settlers had largely integrated into local societies by the 11th century, adopting local languages, customs and identities while retaining some distinctive cultural elements. These assimilated populations no longer served as reliable bases for further Viking activity, but instead developed their own regional identities. Archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates this assimilation process. In Danelaw, burials show a gradual shift from distinctively Scandinavian practices toward local Christian forms. Architectural styles blend Norse and Anglo-Saxon elements. Place names preserve Norse linguistic influence, while material culture shows progressive hybridization of styles and technologies. A similar pattern appears in Normandy, where the Norse settlers rapidly adopted French language and customs while maintaining their military prowess and expansionist tendencies. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, these descendants of Vikings had transformed into feudal Christian knights, though they retained some cultural memory of their Scandinavian origins. In Ireland, the initial Viking coastal settlements gradually evolved into hybrid Hiberno-Norse communities with distinctive cultural characteristics. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford and other towns founded by Vikings became increasingly integrated into Irish political networks through intermarriage, alliances and cultural exchange, while maintaining trading connections across the Norse world. This process of assimilation wasn't one way. Even as Viking settlers adopted elements of local cultures, they introduced Scandinavian influences that permanently altered these societies. Legal concepts, artistic motifs, shipbuilding techniques, urban planning, and thousands of vocabulary items entered local languages and practices, creating hybrid cultural forms that outlasted direct Viking political control. The transformation from raiders to traders represents another crucial aspect of the Viking Age's conclusion. While trade had always accompanied raiding, the balance between these activities shifted decisively during the 11th century. Archaeological evidence shows increasing standardization of weights, measures, and commercial practices across the Viking world, indicating more regular and institutionalized trade relationships. Excavations at late Viking Age. Urban centres reveal specialised craft production aimed at export markets, standardised combs, textiles, iron products and soapstone vessels manufactured in quantity for foreign trade. Harbour facilities expanded to accommodate larger merchant vessels. Coinage became more common, with several Scandinavian kingdoms establishing their own mints producing currency designed to facilitate commercial rather than merely political purposes. This commercial transformation didn't mean complete abandonment of maritime violence. Piracy continued, and the line between merchant and raider remained fluid in many contexts. However, the nature of this violence changed from the earlier pattern of seasonal raiding expeditions targeting wealthy religious centres toward more opportunistic predation on shipping or coastal settlements. The large-scale, politically significant raids that had characterised the early Viking Age largely disappeared by the mid-11th century. The Norse colonies in the North Atlantic followed a somewhat different trajectory from mainland Scandinavia. Iceland maintained its distinctive identity as a commonwealth of free farmers, gradually accepting Christianity while preserving many traditional legal and social structures. Greenland's Norse settlements persisted in relative isolation, continuing a modified Viking Age lifestyle long after it had transformed into the Scandinavian homelands. However, even these remote outposts experienced the broader pattern of Christianization and increasing integration into European economic networks. By the early 12th century, Scandinavia had fundamentally transformed from the society that had launched the first Viking raids 3 centuries earlier. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had consolidated into recognisable medieval kingdoms with established royal dynasties, administrative structures, and church organisation. Urban centres had developed beyond mere trading posts into true towns with diverse economic functions. Christianity had largely replaced traditional Norse religion, though folk practices preserved elements of older beliefs. This transformed Scandinavia remained distinctive within medieval Europe, but operated within shared frameworks of Christian kingship, feudal relationships, and commercial exchange rather than standing outside these systems as raiders and outsiders. The Viking Age had concluded not through catastrophic defeat, but through successful adaptation to changing circumstances, a final demonstration of the flexibility and pragmatism that had characterised Norse culture throughout this remarkable period. The Viking Age, though relatively brief in the sweep of history, left an outsized legacy that continues to shape our world. From genetic heritage to legal traditions, from linguistic influences to maritime innovations, the Norse impact extended far beyond their era of expansion and remains visible in numerous aspects of modern life across multiple continents. Perhaps the most tangible Viking legacy appears in the genetic composition of populations across their sphere of influence. Recent DNA studies have revealed the substantial Scandinavian contribution to the gene pools of regions they settled. In the Orkney and Shetland Islands, up to 30% of male genetic lineages derive from Norse settlers. The figure reaches 15 to 20% in parts of northern Scotland, Ireland, and the Isle of Man. In northern England's former Danelaw territories, Scandinavian genetic markers appear in 10 to 15% of the population, while even Normandy shows measurable Norse genetic influence, despite centuries of subsequent mixing. Iceland presents a particularly clear case of Viking genetic legacy. Studies of modern Icelandic DNA indicate that approximately 75 to 80% of male lineages derive from Norse settlers, primarily from Western Norway, while female lineages show a higher proportion, 50 to 60%, of Celtic origin, confirming saga accounts of Vikings bringing Irish and Scottish women, both as wives and slaves, during the settlement period. This genetic evidence has allowed researchers to correlate archaeological and historical records with biological inheritance, creating a more complete picture of Viking migration patterns. The political impact of the Viking Age fundamentally altered state formation across northern Europe. In England, the Viking invasions inadvertently accelerated the unification process by destroying several smaller Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and stimulating Wessex's expansion under Alfred the Great and his successors. The administrative systems developed to defend against and later incorporate Viking territories, including the Burr network, the Third Military Organisation, and the administrative division of shires, created foundations for English governance that would persist for centuries. In Eastern Europe, Scandinavian Rus played a crucial role in establishing the political entities that would eventually evolve into Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. While the extent of direct Norse influence remains debated, archaeological and historical evidence confirms that Scandinavian elites provided organisational leadership during the crucial formative period of the first East Slavic state, centred on Kiev. The very name Russia derives from Rus, preserving this Norse connection in the world's largest country. In France, Viking settlers transformed the region, granted to them into Normandy, a powerful duchy that would later conquer England, Sicily, and parts of the Near East during the Crusades. The Norman combination of Scandinavian martial vigour with French feudal organisation, created one of medieval Europe's most dynamic political forces, with consequences extending across Europe and the Mediterranean. The Vikings' most distinctive political legacy may be their contribution to parliamentary and legal traditions. Iceland's Althing, established around 930 CE, represents the world's oldest parliamentary institution still in existence. While its powers were interrupted during foreign rule, the modern Icelandic parliament traces direct institutional lineage to this Viking Age assembly. The Thing's assemblies, established across Scandinavian territories, introduced concepts of representative governance and legal procedure that influenced later European democratic development. Norse legal concepts left particularly strong imprints on British legal traditions. In northern and eastern England, the Danelaw introduced distinctive legal practices, including the jury system, where legal decisions were made by groups of freemen rather than by professional judges or through trial by ordeal. The division of Yorkshire into ridings, from Old Norse thridjunga, third part, for administrative purposes, persisted into modern times. Terms like law, bylaw, outlaw, and husband entered English legal vocabulary directly from Norse sources. Linguistically, the Viking impact varies dramatically by region, but remains significant across northern Europe. Modern Scandinavian languages, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic, and Faroes, all developed from Old Norse, preserving this Viking Age linguistic heritage with varying degrees of change. Icelandic remains particularly conservative, allowing modern speakers to read medieval texts with relatively little difficulty. In English, the Norse influence penetrated deeply into everyday vocabulary. Words like sky, egg, window, husband, fellow, leg, skin, ill, ugly, weak, wrong, and thousands more derive directly from Old Norse. Pronouns including they, them, and their replaced native Anglo-Saxon forms. Place names across northern and eastern England, those ending in dash by Whitby, Derby, dash Thorpe, Althorpe, dash Toft, and dash Thwaite, map Viking settlement patterns with remarkable precision. This linguistic influence extends to grammar and syntax, with some scholars arguing that Norse contact accelerated English's evolution from a synthetic to a more analytic language structure. Maritime innovations represent one of the Vikings' most significant technological legacies. Their shipbuilding techniques, particularly the clinker-built construction method, where hull planks overlap, influenced European naval architecture for centuries. The Viking combination of sailing and rowing capabilities, shallow draft and seaworthiness, established design principles that would shape northern European vessels well into the early modern period. Navigation techniques developed during Norse exploration of the North Atlantic contributed to later European maritime expansion. While Viking methods relied more on practical observation than instruments, their accumulated knowledge about currents, prevailing winds, bird migrations, and celestial navigation created foundations for subsequent explorers. The Viking discovery of North America, while not leading to permanent settlement, demonstrated the possibility of transatlantic voyaging 5 centuries before Columbus. Artistically, Viking aesthetic sensibilities continued to influence northern European design long after the period's end. The distinctive interlaced animal styles, complex knotwork patterns, and dynamic compositional approaches of Norse art evolved into regional styles that remained visible in medieval church decoration, manuscript illumination, and secular ornament. The urn style, the last major Viking art phase, directly influenced early Romanesque decoration in Scandinavia and beyond. In literature and storytelling, the Norse contribution has been particularly enduring. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, but preserving earlier oral traditions, represent one of the world's great literary achievements. These remarkably sophisticated narratives, with their psychological depth, complex characterization, and realistic style, influenced modern novel development and continue to inspire writers today. The mythological material preserved in the poetic Edda, and prose. Edda has provided source material for countless literary, artistic, and musical works from Wagner's Ring Cycle to Marvel's Thor films. Perhaps less tangible, but equally significant, is the Viking contribution to cultural imagination. The Norse combination of exploration, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and pragmatic adaptation to challenging environments has become an archetype that continues to resonate. From Antarctic explorers explicitly modelling themselves on Norse predecessors, to space agencies naming missions after Viking concepts, this legacy of bold exploration remains powerful. The archaeological rediscovery of the Viking Age has itself become part of their legacy. The spectacular 19th century excavations of the Gokstad and Oseberg ships in Norway transformed public understanding of Viking technological achievements. The 1960 discovery of Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland confirmed the Norse discovery of North America, validating saga accounts previously dismissed as legend. Ongoing excavations continue to reveal new aspects of Viking life, with recent discoveries using advanced technologies to uncover previously hidden settlements, shipwrecks and artefacts. Modern Scandinavia's international reputation for egalitarianism, pragmatic design, and maritime expertise has roots traceable to Viking Age cultural patterns. While modern Nordic societies have evolved far beyond their medieval antecedents, certain cultural continuities persist, from consensus-based decision-making to practical approaches to environmental challenges. The relatively strong position of women in modern Scandinavian societies partially reflects the unusual legal rights women maintained throughout the region's history. The Viking legacy extends even to modern popular culture, where Norse imagery, mythology, and historical references appear in everything from sports team names to video games, from fantasy literature to heavy metal music. While these popular representations often distort historical reality, perpetuating myths like horned helmets that archaeologists have long debunked, they demonstrate the continuing fascination these northern seafarers hold in global imagination. This enduring fascination reflects something fundamental about the Viking phenomenon. During their relatively brief historical moment, these Scandinavian sailors, traders, raiders, settlers, and state builders demonstrated remarkable human adaptability. They navigated from Baghdad to Newfoundland using technologies that would seem primitive by later standards. They established communities in environments ranging from the Mediterranean to the Arctic. They transformed from pagan raiders to Christian kings within a few generations. This capacity for adaptation and reinvention, perhaps more than any specific innovation or conquest, represents their most significant legacy, a testament to human resilience and creativity in the face of both challenge and opportunity. As we conclude our journey through the Viking Age, we return to the questions that began our exploration. Who were these people who burst onto the European stage with such dramatic impact? What drove their remarkable expansion? How did they navigate vast distances with seemingly limited technology? What explains their disproportionate influence across multiple continents? Archaeological discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of the Vikings and their world. Recent excavations using ground-penetrating radar have revealed previously unknown ship burials, settlement patterns, and trading connections. The Geirmundbu helmet found in Norway, one of the few complete Viking helmets ever discovered, confirms that actual Norse headgear bore no resemblance to the horned helmets of popular imagination. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains has demonstrated far more female participation in Viking migration than previously recognised, challenging assumptions about gender roles in Norse expansion. Perhaps most significantly, DNA studies have transformed our understanding of Viking identity and movement. The massive Viking DNA project, analysing genetic material from over 400 Viking Age skeletons, revealed that Scandinavian genetic influence spread widely but unevenly across Europe. It also demonstrated substantial genetic diversity within Viking communities themselves, with evidence of ancestry from southern and eastern Europe, and even North Africa, appearing in some Viking contexts. These findings confirm that Viking was more a cultural and occupational identity than a strictly ethnic one, a way of life that incorporated people from various backgrounds into its expansive networks. This scientific evidence helps correct the distorted image of Vikings that persists in popular culture. From Wagner's operas to Marvel films, from video games to television series, Vikings remain fixtures in entertainment media, usually portrayed as either one-dimensional barbarians or anachronistically modernised heroes. The historical reality was far more complex. Neither the mindless savages described by terrified Christian chroniclers, nor the noble freedom fighters sometimes depicted in romantic nationalist accounts. The actual Norse were products of their time and environment, capable of both extraordinary brutality and remarkable cultural sophistication. The same people who conducted shocking raids on defenceless monasteries also created intricate poetry, established far-reaching trade networks, and developed legal systems that protected individual rights. This complexity makes them more rather than less interesting as historical subjects, revealing the full range of human capacity for both destruction and creation. Why does the Viking Age continue to fascinate us more than a millennium after its conclusion? Beyond the superficial appeal of their dramatic imagery, the Vikings represent a unique historical moment when a previously peripheral region suddenly projected influence across much of the known world. Their expansion occurred at a pivotal transition between the post-Roman early medieval period and the more structured feudal society that would characterise later medieval Europe. The Vikings both accelerated this transition and were ultimately transformed by it. Their story contains elements that resonate with modern concerns: globalisation and cultural exchange, technological innovation enabling new forms of connectivity, climate change influencing human migration, the tension between violence and commerce in cross-cultural encounters. In studying the Vikings, we gain perspective not just on the past, but on enduring patterns in human social development. The Viking Age reminds us that historical change often occurs through complex interactions rather than simple cause and effect relationships. The Norse expansion resulted from multiple interconnected factors: climate fluctuations, population pressure, technological innovation, political developments, economic opportunities, and cultural values all contributed to this remarkable phenomenon. Similarly, the Age's conclusion came not through any single decisive defeat, but through gradual transformation as circumstances changed and Scandinavians adapted to new realities. In world historical perspective, the Vikings represent a fascinating case study in how relatively small populations can exert outsized influence through mobility, adaptability, and timing. From their Scandinavian homeland, sparsely populated by medieval standards, Norse travellers, traders, and settlers established connections spanning thousands of miles, linking previously isolated regions into new networks of exchange. Their ships, carrying not just warriors and goods, but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices, served as vectors of both disruption and development across the medieval world. The legacy of these northern seafarers extends far beyond their brief historical moment. In the genes of populations from Russia to Greenland, in the vocabulary of modern English, in legal concepts and literary traditions, in place names and cultural memories, the Viking impact remains visible. More subtly, their influence persists in the political geography of modern Europe, in maritime traditions, and in the cultural heritage claimed by millions who trace ancestry to regions touched by Norse expansion. As we close this exploration of the Viking Age, we can appreciate these complex northerners not as one-dimensional raiders or romantic heroes, but as fully human actors navigating a challenging world with the tools, knowledge, and values available to them. Their achievements and limitations, their innovations and brutalities, their practical adaptability and cultural conservatism all form part of a historical legacy that continues to reward careful study and thoughtful interpretation. The real Viking Age, beyond the myths and stereotypes, offers a window into a formative period when the interactions of diverse peoples across vast distances created new possibilities and challenges. In studying this remarkable chapter of human history, we gain not just knowledge of the past, but perspective on the ongoing processes of cultural exchange, technological adaptation, and social transformation that continue to shape our world today.